Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken, your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic. You're listening to Audible Archives. I'm Raul, writer, host, and witness to every shadow behind the case files. In these next 5 investigations, the patterns grow darker, the stakes rise, and S.R.H faces forces beyond reason, where guilt hides in plain sight and justice isn't always clean. These are cases 16 through 20. Welcome to the next descent.
Case 16, The Silence. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes sat at his desk, the weight of the world pressing against his temples. The early morning silence of his office felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the chaos that often consumed his thoughts. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the worn wood, the rhythm a mere echo of his unsettled mind. In his line of work, silence was both a luxury and a harbinger. Nothing had happened yet, but it never stayed that way for long. The shrill buzz of the phone cut through the quiet, sharp and insistent. Hughes snapped to attention, his hand reaching for the receiver without hesitation. A terse voice filled the air, laced with urgency. "Detective Hughes," came the voice, clipped and professional. "We need you at St. Cecilia's psychiatric facility immediately. There's been a disappearance. A doctor, a highly placed one, has vanished." The words hit like a blow to the gut. St. Cecilia's wasn't just any psychiatric facility. It was a fortress, a place that housed the city's most dangerous minds, those who had once been seen as the intellectual elite, now twisted by their own brilliance. Hughes had heard of St. Cecilia's, and he had heard of Dr. Evelyn Crane, the doctor who had earned her place among the highest ranks in the psychiatric world. She wasn't just respected, she was revered. But lately, her name had become linked with one patient in particular, a name that sent a shiver down Hughes' spine: Dr. Felix Holloway. Holloway was no ordinary patient. Once a renowned psychiatrist, Holloway had turned his intellect toward crafting the most disturbing, calculated spree of murders the city had ever seen. His crimes were methodical, chillingly precise, and his mind, the very thing that had made him a prodigy, had become his most dangerous weapon. After being captured, Holloway had been locked away under the tightest security, his presence at St. Cecilia's little more than a shadow of his former self. But even now, whispers of his genius and malevolent charm persisted in the halls. "Send me the details on the way," Hughes replied, his voice steady despite the tightening knot in his stomach. "I'll be there in 15. The line clicked dead, and Hughes stood, a cold, familiar tension settling over him as he grabbed his coat. His mind raced through the possibilities, another vanishing act, another puzzle to solve. But something about this felt different, as though the fabric of the case was woven with darker threads. The disappearance of Dr. Crane wasn't just another strange event, it was connected to Holloway, and that connection hinted at something far more sinister. His boots echoed against the worn floors of the precinct as he headed out into the cool morning air. The city felt quieter than usual, the fog hanging heavy in the streets as if nature itself sensed the storm brewing. Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking, that by the time he arrived, the answers he sought might already be slipping through his fingers. One thing was certain: the disappearance of Dr. Crane was only the first move in a game far more dangerous than he could yet comprehend. St. Cecilia's loomed ahead, its silhouette carved against the cloudy sky, a stark, imposing structure perched on a hill like an ancient fortress, casting long shadows over the sprawling grounds below. The facility had a reputation for housing the city's most dangerous minds, its towering stone walls designed not only to contain but to intimidate. As Hughes arrived, he could already feel the palpable tension in the air, a sense of unease that clung to the staff like a sickness. The staff moved with a nervous energy, their faces drawn and pale, whispers circulating in hushed tones. Some avoided his gaze entirely, while others glanced over at him in fleeting, anxious looks, as though his presence might somehow unravel the fragile calm that still held the place together. Hughes had learned long ago that fear wasn't just a feeling, it was a currency in places like this. He walked briskly through the sterile halls, each step echoed by the heavy silence that had settled over St. Cecilia's like a shroud. He was guided to the administration offices where the facility director, Gregory Hall, awaited. The man was a slight, anxious figure with a hunched posture, his face pale, his eyes wide with stress. His hands were wringing nervously at his sides, betraying the panic bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Detective Hughes," Hall said, his voice tight. I don't know where to begin. It's like she just vanished into thin air." The staff had filled Hughes in on the details. Dr. Evelyn Crane had been conducting interviews with one patient in particular for weeks, Dr. Felix Holloway. Holloway, once a rising star in criminal psychiatry, had become a living nightmare after his spree of murders that had terrorized the city. His crimes were calculated and brutal, his every move chillingly precise, like a master architect of horror. His ability to manipulate those around him was almost as terrifying as his intellect. Hughes had heard of Holloway before. His name was whispered with a mix of fear and fascination in criminal circles. A brilliant mind, no doubt, but one twisted beyond measure. Holloway had murdered without mercy and had seemingly reveled in the chaos he left behind. The murders weren't just acts of violence, they were elaborate puzzles, each crime a grotesque riddle wrapped in a deadly enigma. Despite his capture and imprisonment, Holloway had never truly been understood. His crimes continued to haunt the city's psyche, his motives hidden behind layers of manipulation and deceit. "How did she disappear?" Hughes asked, his tone sharp and direct as he stared down the director. Hall shifted nervously under Hughes' gaze. We don't know," he stammered, glancing over his shoulder as if he feared Holloway himself might be lurking somewhere nearby. "She went to see him alone. She said she needed to hear his side of things, that she needed to understand him, his motivations, his mind. We didn't approve of it. None of us did. But she insisted. And then, she was gone. No trace. No struggle. Just silence." Hughes' eyes narrowed, the words echoing in his mind. Silence. That one word hit harder than any of the others. It felt like the absence of something deliberate, something sinister. A disappearance without a sound, a vanishing without a struggle. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen by accident. A chill ran down Hughes' spine, the same unsettling feeling creeping back into his chest. He had felt it before, on cases that were never as simple as they first appeared, where the darkness lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to swallow everything whole. This wasn't just a missing persons case. Something much darker was at play here. He turned toward Hall, his mind already turning over the facts. When did she last make contact? Did she leave any messages behind? She didn't, Hall said, voice trembling. We've gone through her things. Her notes, her recordings, everything. She didn't leave a trace of what she was thinking or planning. And after she went into Holloway's cell, the cameras went blank. No footage. No audio. It was like he'd erased her from the building. The word erased struck Hughes with a cold finality. Holloway was no ordinary criminal. He wasn't just a patient locked away in a cell, he was a master of the mind, a manipulator who could twist perception and reality itself. Hughes knew he was facing something far more dangerous than a simple disappearance. He was up against a mind that could destroy not just bodies, but entire lives, unraveling them thread by thread. "You're telling me," Hughes said, his voice low, "that a woman of Dr. Crane's intellect, someone who knew the risks, just walked into Holloway's cell without a second thought and then vanished?" Hall nodded, his face pale and tense. "She was confident, detective. Too confident. She was determined to understand him, to crack the case that no one else could. We warned her about Holloway. We told her she didn't understand what she was dealing with." "Clearly," Hughes muttered. He turned, scanning the walls of the facility, feeling as if they were closing in on him. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into Holloway's twisted world, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though no one was around. Hughes took a long breath, steadying himself. He had dealt with men like Holloway before, criminals who played games with the law, who twisted people's lives into knots for their own amusement. But Holloway was different. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a puppeteer, a mind that saw the world not as it was, but as a stage for his grand performance. As Hughes made his way down the hallway, he knew that Dr. Crane's disappearance was only the beginning. Holloway's game had just started, and Hughes had no choice but to play along. But in this twisted game, the rules were his alone to define, and Hughes was already feeling the edges of the trap closing in around him. Hughes was escorted to Holloway's cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the silence of the dimly lit hallway. The sound was more than just the closure of a door, it felt like the sealing of a fate, one that had been designed long before Hughes arrived. The bars were thick, and the walls even thicker, but it was the stillness inside the cell that truly unnerved him. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, the calm before a storm, the silence of a predator waiting to strike. Dr. Felix Holloway sat at a small desk near the back of the cell, facing the wall, his posture rigid and still. There was something unnervingly calm about him, as though the man was no longer the infamous, brutal criminal who had once gripped the city in fear. Instead, he appeared almost peaceful, a serene figure, as if completely at ease with the madness of his own existence. Hughes stood at the threshold of the cell, his gaze fixed on the back of Holloway's head. He had dealt with dangerous minds before, but this was different. Holloway had never been fully understood, and Hughes wasn't sure he ever would be. His reputation for intelligence and cruelty had only grown over time, but now, it seemed Holloway was playing a new kind of game, one that Hughes wasn't sure he was ready for. As if sensing Hughes' presence, Holloway slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto Hughes with an unnerving calmness, and a cold, almost predatory smile crept across his face. The smile wasn't one of joy, but rather one of knowing, of control. Holloway knew exactly what game was being played, and Hughes was just another piece on his chessboard. "Detective Hughes," Holloway purred, his voice a smooth, calculated whisper that seemed to slide into the air like a cold draft. "You've come for me again, haven't you? Just like they all do. Everyone wants to know how my mind works, what drives me, what pushes me to such extremes." Hughes remained still, his eyes narrowed, watching the man in front of him. He had seen Holloway's interviews, read the transcripts, and studied the case files. He knew the pattern. Holloway's every move, his every word, was part of an elaborate dance. The psychiatrist was always in control, always a step ahead. Hughes had expected this game of manipulation, but it didn't make it any easier to endure. "I'm not here for you," Hughes replied, his voice calm but firm, refusing to play into Holloway's theatrics. "I'm here because of Dr. Crane. She's disappeared, and I think you know why." At the mention of Dr. Evelyn Crane, Holloway's eyes sparked with a twisted amusement. The smile on his face deepened, stretching ever so slightly, revealing the darkness beneath the carefully constructed facade. He was enjoying this far too much. "Ah, Dr. Crane," Holloway mused, his voice dripping with a honeyed satisfaction. "She was an interesting case, wasn't she? You see, detective, it's always fascinating to watch how the brilliant minds of those around me try to probe into mine. They come, they ask their questions, and they think they can understand me. But no one truly can they? Not really." He leaned forward slightly, his posture languid, as though the conversation was of no real consequence to him. "She had a particular interest in me. She wanted to know what made me tick, how I think, how I plan. She sought to get inside my head. But there's a problem with that, detective. Some minds are not meant to be understood. Some things are better left alone." Hughes felt a tightness in his chest, his jaw clenched as the frustration of dealing with Holloway's games mounted. He had heard the rumors about Holloway's ability to manipulate, to twist people's thoughts and perceptions. It wasn't just that Holloway was a murderer, he was a puppeteer, playing with the strings of anyone who dared approach him. And now, Dr. Crane, who had been so determined to understand him, was likely a part of the game he had orchestrated. "Where is she, Holloway?" Hughes' voice came out low, edged with a sharpness that contrasted Holloway's sickening calm. His fists clenched involuntarily. "Tell me where she is." Holloway's smile deepened further, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and something darker. "Oh, detective." She asked the wrong questions. He leaned back in his chair, the shadows of the cell stretching long behind him, casting him in an almost theatrical light. People who dig too deep into the darkness sometimes find it staring back at them. It's a simple rule, really. Hughes' mind raced, the pieces clicking together. Holloway wasn't just taunting him, he was revealing the nature of the game. Holloway never played fair. He had a hand in Dr. Crane's disappearance, no doubt about it. But Hughes could sense that Holloway wasn't just interested in hiding the truth, he was toying with Hughes, testing how far he could push him before the detective cracked. Hughes took a step closer to the bars, his gaze fixed on Holloway. "You're playing a game, Holloway," he said, his tone a bit sharper now. "But I'm not here to play. You've got answers. And I'm going to make you give them." Holloway's smile faltered just for a second, but then it returned, colder than before. He tilted his head, as though considering Hughes' words. "Is that so?" Holloway mused. "Well, detective, let's see how long you can hold on to that resolve. Because, in my experience, everyone has a breaking point. Everyone." The game had already begun. But this time, Hughes knew that Holloway wasn't just a madman locked in a cell. He was a mind with a plan, a mind that could break anyone who dared to challenge him. Hughes knew he had to play along, but the rules were his alone to define, and Holloway was already a step ahead. As the hours dragged on, Hughes became consumed by the task at hand. The investigation seemed to lead in circles, with no clear path forward. The more he dug into Holloway's past, the more he realized the depth of the man's manipulations. Holloway had orchestrated a life of calculated chaos, each move designed to keep others off balance, unsure of what was real and what was part of his game. But Hughes was determined. He couldn't afford to falter now, not when Dr. Crane's life hung in the balance. He spent the evening sifting through case files, cross-referencing old reports, and reviewing the facility's security footage. He noted every small detail, every twitch in Holloway's expression, every cryptic line in his writings, hoping something would break through the wall of silence. Yet, as the night deepened, his frustration mounted. Each clue pointed toward Holloway's mind games, but nothing concrete connected him to Dr. Crane's disappearance. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the eerie absence of her presence. Then, as Hughes sat in the dimly lit office, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, something caught his attention, an anomaly in the security footage from the night Dr. Crane disappeared. It was subtle, easily overlooked by anyone who wasn't searching for it. But Hughes wasn't just looking for answers, he was looking for Holloway's fingerprints on the case. And he found them, hidden in plain sight. The footage showed Holloway, alone in his cell, but there was something off about the angle of the camera. For a brief moment, just before the image cut out, a hidden door became visible, a concealed entrance that led to a secret room behind the false wall of his cell. Hughes felt a chill creep up his spine as he rewound the footage and zoomed in, confirming his suspicion. Holloway had been living in a space far more elaborate, and far more sinister, than anyone had known. The secret room was nothing like the rest of Holloway's cell. It had been designed to look like a simple storage closet, but now, under Hughes' scrutiny, it revealed a dark, twisted purpose. The walls were lined with strange sculptures, their grotesque shapes disturbing in their perfection. Old, weathered books were stacked haphazardly, their pages yellowed with age, and there, in the center of the room, was a workbench littered with tools that had no place in a psychiatric facility. But it was the drawings that truly disturbed Hughes. On the wall, pinned with care, were a series of intricate sketches, horrifying images that seemed to come alive in the flickering light of the surveillance footage. Each one depicted scenes of terror and madness, twisted faces contorted in agony, buildings crumbling, and bodies twisted in unnatural positions. The images were chaotic, disjointed, as though the artist was trying to capture the very essence of fear itself. Among the drawings, one in particular stood out to Hughes, a drawing of a woman. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the image. It was unmistakably Dr. Crane. The drawing showed her bound and gagged, her body slumped against a dark backdrop. Her eyes were wide with terror, frozen in a moment of pure fear. The lines of the sketch were raw, urgent, as though Holloway had poured all his twisted energy into capturing that one moment of terror. Beneath the image, in Holloway's precise handwriting, were the words, "The truth is in silence." Hughes' heart raced as he stared at the drawing. The message was clear, and it was chilling. Holloway had been playing a game with Dr. Crane, using her curiosity and intellect against her. She had fallen victim to his manipulation, just as Hughes had feared. She had pushed too far, asked too many questions, and in return, Holloway had decided to silence her. But not just by making her disappear, he was making her part of his twisted art, ensuring her terror would remain as a permanent mark on his deranged psyche. A shiver ran down Hughes' spine. The puzzle was starting to take shape, but it was worse than he had imagined. Dr. Crane had learned something Holloway couldn't afford to let anyone uncover. And now, Hughes realized, the true nature of the game had been revealed. Holloway was playing a long game, one where silence was not only a weapon but the ultimate form of control. Hughes took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. This was more than just a missing person case. It was a deeper, darker game, one that had twisted Dr. Crane into one of Holloway's many victims. The silence wasn't just about the absence of sound, it was about control. Holloway had used silence to erase Dr. Crane, to bury her in the depths of his madness. And Hughes now had to figure out how to shatter that silence before it consumed them both. He stood up from the desk, determination hardening in his chest. Holloway's game had taken a terrifying turn, but Hughes wasn't about to back down. He would find Dr. Crane, and he would expose the truth behind Holloway's twisted mind, no matter what it took. The morning fog lingered over the grounds of St. Cecilia's psychiatric facility as Hughes made his way back to Holloway's cell. The chill in the air matched the weight in his chest, each step towards the compound feeling like a march towards something inevitable. He had spent the entire night turning over the case in his mind, every image of Dr. Crane's terror, every unsettling drawing by Holloway, replaying in his thoughts like an unrelenting loop. He couldn't stop it. And now, he couldn't stop himself either. He had to confront Holloway, face to face, once more. The large, iron doors of the psychiatric facility creaked as they swung open, revealing the stark halls, each step echoing through the cold emptiness of the place. The staff greeted him in subdued whispers, their faces pale and tight-lipped, as if they, too, had succumbed to the suffocating tension that had become the norm ever since Holloway's twisted influence had begun seeping into the walls of the facility. They had long since given up questioning the things that happened in this place. The halls were too quiet. Hughes could almost hear his own heartbeat, each thud a reminder of how little time he had left. They were no closer to finding Dr. Crane, and the longer Holloway went unchecked, the further the darkness would spread. Hughes reached Holloway's cell at last, a steel-reinforced door at the end of a narrow hallway. The guard on duty gave him a wary look, as though unsure what to make of the detective's grim expression. Without a word, Hughes nodded, and the door was unlocked. Inside, Holloway sat as he always did, perfectly still, his back straight, his hands folded on the table before him. His eyes, calculating and unnerving, tracked Hughes' every movement as he stepped inside. There was no hint of emotion in his face, no fear, no regret. Just that same unsettling calm that Hughes had come to recognize as Holloway's version of control. The doctor had not even risen from his chair to greet him. "I've come to find out where she is, Holloway," Hughes said, his voice sharp with an urgency he could no longer suppress. "Dr. Crane. You've been playing games with me long enough. I know you're the one behind her disappearance. Tell me where she is." Holloway's lips twitched into a smile, slow and deliberate, as though Hughes had just uttered a joke he didn't quite understand. "Detective Hughes, it's always the same with you, isn't it? You come in here, all fury and righteousness, demanding answers, as if I owe you something." Hughes's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His frustration bubbled to the surface. "I'm done with your games, Holloway. Where is she?" His voice rose, the tension breaking like the snap of a wire. Holloway continued to smile, his eyes reflecting nothing but a quiet, unshakable certainty. "You know, detective, you're really quite good at this. You've managed to track me down, piece together the little puzzles I leave behind, but you don't truly understand what you're dealing with. The mind, our minds, are delicate instruments. But your mind, it's particularly vulnerable. I can see it, can't I? The way you tremble just beneath the surface. Hughes had no time for Holloway's taunting. Enough. I'm not here to play your mind games. Where is Dr. Crane? Holloway stood slowly, his movements calculated and deliberate. His eyes never left Hughes, the smile never fading. The mind is a fragile thing, detective. We all have our limits. You see, Dr. Crane wanted to understand me, wanted to know what made me tick. She thought she could unlock the mystery of my crimes, peel back the layers of my psyche and expose them for all the world to see. But understanding, detective, always comes at a cost. Hughes stepped closer, his voice lowering, edged with rage. You killed her, didn't you? She was getting too close, so you silenced her. You took her because she was a threat, because she was too smart for her own good. Holloway's smile deepened, the corners of his lips curling upward, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. No, detective. I didn't kill her. He paused for effect, his gaze unwavering. I liberated her. Hughes recoiled slightly, his confusion momentarily catching him off guard. Liberated her? What the hell does that mean? Holloway moved closer to the table, his hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of serene composure. I gave her what she wanted. She wanted to understand me, to hear the truth. And, in the end, I gave her the final piece of the puzzle. The truth that she could never unsee. You see, it's a simple thing, really. The silence that accompanies true clarity. When you understand, truly understand, there's nothing left to say. And when there's nothing left to say, there's nothing left but silence. Hughes felt a sharp pang in his chest. It was as though Holloway had just reached into his mind and twisted something deep within him. The air in the room grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He stared at Holloway, his breath shallow, his body tense with the weight of understanding that was beginning to settle upon him. You're telling me she's gone? You've erased her? Hughes's voice trembled despite his efforts to remain steady. Holloway's smile never wavered, his eyes gleaming with an unnerving sense of satisfaction. Gone? No, detective. She's not gone. She's where she belongs, where she always belonged. She knows the truth now. She's no longer trapped in the cage of understanding. She is free. The room felt smaller, darker, as Hughes processed Holloway's words. Dr. Crane had fallen victim to Holloway's game in the most profound way. She had uncovered the darkness within him, the abyss, and in doing so, she had become part of it. Holloway had taken her, not because she had been a threat, but because she had dared to unlock the final secret of his twisted mind. And now, Hughes realized, she was lost to that silence, lost in the same void Holloway had dragged countless others into before her. Hughes could feel the darkness closing in, an oppressive weight bearing down on him, as though the truth he had uncovered had somehow trapped him in its grip. The silence Holloway had created was not just the absence of sound, it was the absence of reason, of humanity, of everything that made the world sensible. In Holloway's mind, silence was the ultimate power, the one thing that could bind and break people with the greatest of ease. Hughes stepped back, his head spinning with the revelation. He had known, on some level, that Holloway was a dangerous man, but the full scope of his madness had only now come into view. This wasn't just about killing or torturing, it was about control. Holloway didn't need to destroy his victims. He just needed to make them understand. And once they did, they became part of his twisted vision, erased from the world, lost in the silence of his mind. As Hughes left Holloway's cell, the final truth gnawed at him like an open wound. The silence Holloway had created was not just an absence of sound. It was the absence of everything: reason, humanity, identity. It was the silence of the mind, a void that consumed everything in its path. And now, Hughes knew, Dr. Crane was part of it. The thought settled heavily in his chest as he exited the facility, the weight of Holloway's game pressing on him from all sides. There would be no simple resolution to this case, no way to tie it up in neat little packages. The silence would remain, lingering in the spaces between the answers Hughes had uncovered, stretching into the dark corners of his own mind. And the silence, he realized, might be the most terrifying thing of all. Case 17, The Silent Witness. It was a cold autumn morning when Detective Stephen Raul Hughes was called to the scene of a grisly discovery. The phone call had been brief but urgent. A family of 4 had been found dead in their home, a quiet farmhouse tucked away on the outskirts of town. Hughes knew instantly this wasn't just another routine case. His gut twisted as he donned his coat and prepared to confront whatever lay in the depths of this nightmare. The farmhouse sat on the edge of a winding dirt road, its weathered paint blending with the surrounding trees that stood like silent sentinels. Hughes arrived to find a heavy police presence already on site. Forensic officers, their faces drawn with the weight of the scene, worked methodically, cataloging every inch of the crime scene. Inside, the house was eerily still. It looked almost too pristine for a place where death had recently visited. Each member of the Mercer family, Thomas and Claire Mercer, along with their 2 children, Olivia and Peter, lay lifeless, executed with chilling precision. The bodies were ranged just so, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, as though the act had been quick, purposeful. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, and no defensive wounds on the victims. The killings were clean, like the stroke of a surgeon's scalpel. The Mercers were well known in the area: Thomas, a successful farmer, and Claire, a local schoolteacher. Their children, Olivia and Peter, were students at the nearby school. From all accounts, they were an ordinary family, content with their lives. So how could this happen? What twisted force could have driven someone to wipe out an entire family without leaving a trace? Hughes stood in the sterile, dimly lit living room, his eyes scanning the scene with deliberate care. A sense of unease settled over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. Something was off, something that didn't quite add up. The silence in the house was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. One of the forensic officers, a young man named Martinez, approached Hughes, his expression grim. No forced entry. No sign of robbery. No defensive wounds. Whoever did this, they knew the victims. They were comfortable in this house. This wasn't random. Or they were too comfortable, Hughes muttered under his breath, his eyes lingering on the victims' faces. But why leave it so clean? So calculated? It's almost professional. Martinez nodded. It's chilling, sir. The more we look into it, the more it seems like the killer knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted the family gone. No mess. No noise. Hughes studied the bodies for a moment longer, his mind turning over the possibilities. His thoughts turned to the nature of the violence itself. This wasn't just about murder, it wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about erasure. The killing of a family, not for any obvious reason, but because they were a blank canvas, wiped clean. As he turned to leave the room, he spotted something that made his heart skip, a small, leather-bound book on the coffee table, its pages yellowed and worn. The book didn't belong in the otherwise neat house. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, but it was the inscription on the first page that caught his attention, "To the future we never knew." The words hung in the air, unsettling in their simplicity. What did it mean? Was this the killer's message? Or had the book been left as a clue for someone to find? Either way, Hughes knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had orchestrated this, someone with a purpose. And that purpose, Hughes realized, was just beginning to unfold. The investigation moved swiftly, as Hughes took charge with an unsettling sense of urgency. The sheriff's department had already been alerted, and local law enforcement, though shaken, worked methodically to preserve the scene and gather evidence. Hughes had already spoken to Sheriff Nolan, and together they began to piece together a timeline of the Mercer family's final hours. The neighbors, friends, and colleagues all spoke highly of the Mercers. They were a quiet, reserved family who kept to themselves, with no hint of drama or discord. Thomas was a farmer, respected in the community for his hard work and integrity. Claire was a schoolteacher, beloved by her students and peers. Olivia, their teenage daughter, was described as bright and friendly, while Peter, their young son, was said to be shy but well-liked. There was nothing in their backgrounds to suggest that they might be involved in something so horrific. The more Hughes dug into the family's background, the more it seemed like they had no business being victims of something so brutal. No one had any enemies, no debts, no recent turmoil. They were just a family, leading an ordinary life. The absence of a clear motive troubled Hughes. It didn't fit the pattern of random violence he was accustomed to. Then, while inspecting the kitchen counter, Hughes noticed something unusual: a small piece of paper, hastily discarded but clearly visible. The ink was still fresh, and the paper had been scribbled on in a hurry. It wasn't a note or a typical clue, it was a symbol. A crude but deliberate design, sketched quickly but with purpose. The symbol was unfamiliar to Hughes, but there was an undeniable sense of significance in its simplicity. It felt out of place in the otherwise clean kitchen, like a message from someone who wanted to be sure it was found but didn't have time to explain. Hughes carefully examined the symbol, feeling a vague sense of dread settle over him. Was it a signature, a warning, or perhaps some twisted form of ritual? He couldn't say yet, but he knew it was important. His next move was to visit the local sheriff's office, where he was given full access to the Mercer family's records. Hughes sifted through their financials, personal history, and any public records that might provide a lead. There were no debts, no major life events that could explain the violence that had unfolded in their home. The family had lived a stable, if uneventful, life. No criminal activity, no history of conflict with anyone, nothing out of the ordinary. However, as Hughes dug deeper into the files, he uncovered something that sent a chill down his spine, a disturbing connection to a man named Richard Keller. Keller had once been an acquaintance of Thomas Mercer. Years ago, Keller had been convicted of a string of violent crimes, armed robberies, assaults, and a brutal attack on a local businessman. He had been serving time in prison for these offenses but was released recently, having served his sentence. What was more troubling was that Keller had disappeared shortly after his release, vanishing without a trace. Hughes leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. It was a tenuous connection at best, but Keller's violent past and his sudden disappearance after being released from prison raised alarms. Was Keller somehow involved in the Mercer family's deaths? Did he have a grudge against Thomas Mercer? Or was there a more sinister, deeper connection at play? The more Hughes thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that the symbol on the paper was somehow linked to Keller's disappearance. Had Keller left it behind as a clue, or was someone else involved, someone connected to Keller's past, someone who knew how to keep their tracks covered? Hughes was far from certain, but one thing was clear: this case wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The deaths of the Mercer family had been too calculated, too precise. Whoever was behind it had done their homework, and Hughes had a feeling that the answer lay somewhere within the tangled history of Richard Keller. As he stood up from the desk, Hughes felt the weight of the investigation settle upon him. He had more questions than answers, and the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the case seemed. One thing was undeniable: the silence of the Mercer family's murder was deafening, and someone was hiding something beneath it. Richard Keller's history was steeped in tragedy, a downward spiral that started long before his prison sentence. Hughes knew from the moment Keller's name surfaced that this was more than a simple connection. It was a link to a past that Thomas Mercer had likely tried to forget. Keller had once been a promising student at the local college, known for his intelligence and potential. He had dreamed of a future in business, but those dreams had been shattered when he fell in with the wrong crowd. His criminal activity escalated quickly, and before long, he was arrested for armed robbery. He spent several years in prison, during which he struggled to stay afloat amid the prison's violence and chaos. But upon his release, Keller returned to the small town, determined to rebuild his life. His attempts, however, were unsuccessful. Finding work was difficult for a man with his record, and the bitterness of his past clung to him like a shadow. People who remembered Keller before his conviction spoke of a man full of promise, but the years in prison had hardened him, leaving him a bitter shell of his former self. The connection between Keller and Thomas Mercer was far from ordinary. Before his imprisonment, Keller had been a close friend and almost a mentor to Mercer. Thomas had been a struggling young farmer at the time, and Keller had offered guidance, helping him navigate the complexities of farm ownership and local business dealings. It had been an odd pairing, the well-educated Keller and the down-to-earth Mercer, but it had worked. The two had once been inseparable, bound by a friendship that seemed unbreakable. But something had happened, a rift that severed their relationship. Hughes couldn't yet understand the exact cause, but it was clear that the split had been dramatic. After Keller's release, there was no attempt to rekindle the friendship, no apologies or reconciliations. The two men had gone their separate ways, and though Keller's letters to Thomas Mercer seemed to suggest he wanted to start fresh, there was an underlying bitterness in the words that made Hughes uneasy. The letters Keller had written from prison were filled with vague, almost cryptic messages. On the surface, they seemed like the ramblings of a man trying to piece together a fractured life. Keller spoke about wanting to start fresh and begin anew, but there was a chill inconsistency in the underlying tone of the letters, a message that seemed more like a threat than a plea for redemption. Hughes read one letter carefully, the words standing out as if they were meant for him. "You can't escape the past forever, Thomas." The phrase haunted Hughes, a dark thread weaving through the investigation. The letter was dated shortly before Keller's release, and it was clear that there were unresolved issues between the two men. The phrasing suggested something deeper, an unfinished business, a score that had yet to be settled. For someone like Keller, who had lost everything during his time in prison, it was easy to imagine him clinging to any hope of revenge, especially against the man who had left him behind. As Hughes continued his research, he learned more about the personal dynamics between the two men. Before Keller's fall from grace, Thomas had relied heavily on him for advice, trusting him as a mentor and confidant. But as Thomas's farm began to thrive, Keller's influence faded. Hughes suspected that something had changed in their friendship, a betrayal or a clash of values, that led to the break. The letters hinted at a deep sense of resentment, but Keller's exact motive remained elusive. Despite Keller's apparent desire to move past the pain of the past, Hughes began to see the makings of a possible motive in the letters. Could Keller have seen Thomas's success as a reminder of what he had lost? Could the jealousy and bitterness over their fractured relationship have driven him to murder? Hughes wasn't sure yet, but he had a feeling that Keller's resentment was more than just the remnants of a friendship gone wrong. It was the kind of resentment that could fester for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to explode. The unsettling phrase, "You can't escape the past forever, Thomas," began to take on a new meaning. Keller's actions, the letters, the symbol found at the crime scene, everything was pointing towards something that Hughes had yet to fully comprehend. The past, with all its darkness and hidden resentments, had resurfaced with deadly consequences. But what was the significance of the symbol found in the Mercer home? Was it a warning, a signature, or perhaps a clue to a deeper conspiracy? Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that Keller's return to town was more than just an attempt to rebuild his life. It was part of a much larger, more dangerous plan. But whether Keller was the mastermind behind the murders or simply a pawn in someone else's game remained to be seen. Hughes knew one thing for certain: the case had taken a darker turn, and the secrets of the past were not yet finished with the present. He had to keep digging. Every clue, every letter, every detail pointed to a connection between the past and the brutal murders of the Mercer family. And somewhere, buried beneath all the layers of time and resentment, the truth was waiting to be unearthed. Hughes moved quickly to locate Richard Keller. He knew time was running out, and every moment spent chasing dead ends brought him further from the truth. Keller's past and connection to Thomas Mercer were starting to form a chilling picture, but the real question remained: had Keller's bitterness manifested in the brutal murders of the Mercer family, or was he being set up as a convenient scapegoat? Hughes ordered a full-scale search for Keller, instructing local law enforcement to canvass the town and its outskirts. They traced Keller's last known whereabouts, his sparse record after his release from prison, which had shown an attempt to reintegrate into society. However, Hughes told him there was more to the story. A man like Keller, with a history of violence and a seething resentment toward Mercer, wouldn't disappear quietly. He was the kind of person who burned bridges, leaving only destruction behind. As Hughes examined the places Keller had been seen, he found unsettling patterns. One such lead was a local shopkeeper, who reported seeing Keller buying a significant amount of ammunition only days before the Mercer family was murdered. The shopkeeper had noted Keller's unusually cold demeanor, something that stuck in his mind. He mentioned that Keller seemed agitated, even though the store was typically a peaceful place. The shopkeeper couldn't recall the exact number of boxes, but Hughes knew enough to be alarmed. Someone gearing up for violence, preparing in secret, didn't just wake up one day with a sudden urge to kill. They had a purpose. Following up on that lead, Hughes visited Keller's last known addresses, empty apartments, all of them. It was as if Keller had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of panic. The floors were bare, and there were no personal belongings left behind, suggesting Keller had been in a rush to disappear. This only deepened Hugh's suspicions that Keller was more than just a missing person. He was a fugitive, either on the run or already long gone by the time the murders had been discovered. The investigation seemed to have hit a dead end, but then Hughes received a break. An anonymous tip-off came through, a shaky voice on the other end of the phone that spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of being heard. The caller claimed to have seen Keller near the Mercer farm on the night of the murders. The witness described Keller walking away from the property just after dark, his figure silhouetted against the glow of the farmhouse lights. But the witness had been too far away to approach, and the darkness had obscured any further details. The tip, though vague, fit with the timeline, and Hughes knew that every detail, no matter how small, had to be investigated. With renewed focus, Hughes and his team scoured the area around the Mercer farm. They combed the nearby woods, searched abandoned barns, and checked with locals who might have seen something out of the ordinary that night. No one had heard or seen anything definitive, but there was an undeniable sense that Keller was somehow involved, though the exact connection was still elusive. The breakthrough came when Hughes revisited the crime scene. Something about the house's layout, the way the bodies were positioned, struck him as calculated, too perfect to be random. The lack of any signs of struggle suggested the murderer had known the victims well, or at least had gained their trust. The fact that the murders had been carried out with cold precision, each family member executed in a controlled manner, pointed towards someone with an understanding of violence. Keller's criminal past fit this profile, but something felt off about it. The murders weren't just violent, they were designed to send a message. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of rage. This was personal. The key question continued to gnaw at Hughes: why the Mercer family? Keller had been released from prison and was struggling to find his place in the world. But the intensity of his connection to Thomas Mercer seemed to transcend mere jealousy. This was more than a desire for vengeance, it was a twisted reckoning. The resentment that had festered between the two men, the harsh words in Keller's letters, had apparently boiled over in a shocking act of violence. Hughes paced around the crime scene, piecing the puzzle together. Keller's frustration with Thomas had simmered for years. Keller had once been the mentor, the guiding force in Thomas's life, and now he was a man left to wallow in the failure of his own choices. Had Keller believed that by killing the Mercer family, he would somehow erase the humiliation, the betrayal, the passage of time that had rendered him insignificant? Or had he wanted to send a warning, a message that Thomas could never outrun the ghosts of his past? There were still more questions than answers, but Hughes was closer to the truth than ever before. The pieces were falling into place: Keller's anger, his history with Thomas, his ominous presence in the area around the time of the murders. Hughes now knew with certainty that Keller was not just involved, he was the key to unlocking this case. The unsettling question remained, however, if Keller was indeed responsible for the murders, why had he gone into hiding? What had driven him to disappear so thoroughly? And perhaps more troubling, if Keller had truly been involved, was there someone else pulling the strings from the shadows? Hughes stood at the edge of the Mercer farm, staring out into the dark fields. The answer was out there, waiting for him to find it. But with every new discovery, the case seemed to spiral deeper into a labyrinth of motives, hidden resentments, and unanswered questions. The search for Keller had only just begun, and the truth, no matter how twisted, was still beyond his reach. The investigation had come to its tipping point, and Hughes was no longer chasing mere clues, he was chasing the final piece of the puzzle. The trail had led him here, to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The structure was dilapidated, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the front door stood ajar, as if inviting him in, or perhaps daring him to enter. Hughes took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The air inside the house felt thick, stifling, as though the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. The silence was overwhelming, similar to the quiet that had pervaded the Mercer home after the murders. It was the same silence, but this time, it was broken only by the soft sound of his footsteps. Inside, the house was a grim reflection of its former self, dilapidated furniture, peeling wallpaper, and dark corners that seemed to swallow light. In the farthest corner of the room sat Richard Keller, a hollow shell of the man he once was. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with a manic energy. His disheveled appearance spoke of a man who had been on the run for far too long, someone who had no intention of being found, but who now seemed resigned to his fate. Hughes stepped forward slowly, his hand hovering over the holster of his gun as a precaution, though he knew Keller wasn't likely to resist. The detective's voice cut through the oppressive silence. "You've been on the run long enough, Keller," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "It's over. You can't keep hiding forever." Keller didn't move at first, only shifting his eyes to meet Hughes' gaze. When he spoke, his voice was a fragile whisper, the weight of his words heavy with regret. "I didn't want this, you know," he said, a thin, hollow smile playing at the edges of his lips. "I didn't want to hurt them. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't control it anymore. You killed them," Hughes interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through the air with the blunt force of truth. "You erased them. Just like you erased yourself. What happened, Keller? What drove you to this?" Keller's face twisted, a flicker of something dark passing behind his eyes. For a moment, he looked lost, like a man who was trapped in a prison of his own making, struggling to reconcile his actions with the man he used to be. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, as though to himself. "Thomas was my only friend, my only hope. But when he moved on, when he became successful and left me behind, I couldn't let him forget me. I couldn't let him forget who I was. So I did what I had to do." His voice cracked, and for the first time, Hughes saw the man behind the monster, a broken figure consumed by years of jealousy, resentment, and the kind of obsessive need for recognition that could only end in violence. The confession came slowly, reluctantly, as if Keller were finally confronting the truth himself, not just admitting it to Hughes. "I thought I could start fresh. But it's impossible. It's always there. The past, the debts, the guilt. They follow you. And so do I." Hughes stood still, listening to Keller's rambling words. The detective's mind finally pieced together the twisted logic behind the murders. Keller's motives weren't simple revenge, they were far more insidious. This wasn't just about striking back at Thomas for leaving him behind, it was about erasure. Keller had wanted to destroy everything Thomas had built, every piece of happiness he had found after their falling out. The Mercer family had been collateral damage, mere victims of Keller's need to make his presence known, to make the world remember him, even if it was for a moment of incomprehensible violence. It wasn't just a brutal act of retribution, it was a desperate cry for acknowledgement, for validation. In his warped mind, killing the Mercer family wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a way to ensure Thomas never forgot him. It was as though Keller believed that in erasing the Mercers, he could restore the balance of his own fractured self-worth. His jealousy, once focused on Thomas's success, had turned into a consuming need to prove that he, too, mattered. That he could no longer be ignored. The finality of the confession hit Hughes like a punch to the gut. The investigation was over. Keller had been caught, his motive revealed. But in some ways, the truth only made the case more chilling. The cold calculation behind Keller's actions, the way he had chosen to erase the Mercer family, as if their lives were a mere footnote in his own twisted narrative, was far more terrifying than Hughes had anticipated. As Hughes left the farmhouse, the weight of the case settled heavily on his shoulders. The resolution didn't bring relief, only a haunting sense of loss. The brutal precision of the murders, the cold efficiency with which Keller had carried out the killings, stayed with him. The silence that had echoed in the Mercer household seemed to have followed him, a shadow that lingered long after the investigation had ended. Hughes knew there would be no easy answers. The case had been closed, but the questions remained, unanswered, unresolved. Why had Keller let his past consume him so completely? Why hadn't he sought redemption, or forgiveness, or even peace? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, had Keller truly found peace in his final moments, or had he merely slipped deeper into madness, consumed by the very hatred that had driven him to kill? The world would never fully understand the complexities of Keller's mind, his twisted sense of betrayal, his warped perception of justice. But one thing was certain, the Mercer family was gone, erased from the world, their lives extinguished in a brutal act of violence. And now, Richard Keller would face the consequences of his actions. Hughes could only hope that, in the end, justice would be enough to silence the ghosts of the past. Case 18, The Smoldering Desire. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes arrived at the scene shortly after dawn, the air crisp with the chill of autumn. The small, isolated and sad at the edge of town, nestled on a quiet stretch of land that led into the dense, thick woods. A place where, on nights like this, secrets could thrive under the blanket of darkness. A local resident had called in after hearing suspicious noises around midnight, scraping sounds, the dull thud of something heavy hitting the ground. What they discovered when they ventured out was chilling. The body of George Whitaker, the innkeeper, lay sprawled in the parking lot, his body contorted unnaturally, his blood already darkening the gravel beneath him. His once well-maintained uniform was soaked in red. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of terror, as though he had been struck by something far beyond the physical force that had taken his life. It wasn't just the manner of death that sent a shiver down Hughes' spine, it was the eerie silence of the scene. No screams, no sign of struggle, only the aftermath of a brutal hit-and-run. Hughes stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the body. The police tape was already up, and a few officers were taking photographs and making notes. The evidence was sparse, but it was enough to paint a grim picture. The first responders were still processing the scene, taking careful note of every detail, but Hughes knew there wasn't much to be found here other than the obvious. George Whitaker had been struck by a car, and the car had fled the scene. One of the forensics officers, a young woman named Detective Ramirez, turned to Hughes as he approached. "No witnesses, Detective. We found some skid marks leading off toward the woods, but that's about it. The car's gone. No signs of a robbery, no valuables missing. It's like someone wanted to make sure the body was found, but the car itself was gone. Anything else? Hughes asked, his voice calm, though his mind was racing. The body was moved slightly. It doesn't look like an accident, she said, her brow furrowed as she knelt beside Whitaker's body. You can see the way his head hit the ground, there's a jagged angle. He didn't just fall after the car hit him. It looks like he was struck, then dragged a bit, possibly even hit again. Hughes looked at the ground. He could see the faint trail of shoe prints that led off into the woods, likely left by the driver. Whoever did this wasn't in a rush, Hughes said under his breath, studying the skid marks. They weren't a product of panic, but of someone who knew what they were doing, precise, calculated. The innkeeper, George Whitaker, wasn't just any man. He had run the inn for over 15 years, well known in the community for his steady work ethic, his no-nonsense attitude, and his quick temper. People respected him, but there were rumors. It wasn't just the stormy marriage with his younger wife, Veronica. That, in itself, was enough to generate whispers. Veronica was beautiful, charismatic, and seemingly perfect for a man like George. But the rumors ran deeper. George's jealousy was well known, and his tendency to fly off the handle when things didn't go his way had caused more than a few problems. Whispers of infidelity, however, were a far more troubling subject. Veronica was often seen in the company of a local mechanic named Frank Turner. A man of few words, Frank had a reputation for being a bit dangerous, rough around the edges, and despite his quiet demeanor, he was known to have a temper that matched George's own. No one could say for sure whether an affair had truly taken place, but the gossip in town painted a clear picture. George's control over Veronica had grown more suffocating, and Frank Turner had become a potential source of escape for her. Hughes stood silently for a moment, absorbing all this information. His instincts were never wrong. He could already sense the undercurrents of tension, the tangled web of love, jealousy, and betrayal that would no doubt come to the surface during the investigation. But something else nagged at the back of his mind. Why the hit-and-run? Why not a confrontation, if Frank Turner was involved? Why not something more direct? It didn't add up, and Hughes knew better than anyone that when something didn't add up, it usually meant someone was hiding something. Who found the body? Hughes asked, turning to Ramirez, who was still working over the scene. A local resident. Old man Harris. He lives just up the road. He said he heard something around midnight, but didn't think much of it until he saw the car leaving in a hurry. He didn't get a good look at the driver, though, Ramirez replied. Harris has lived here for years. He's one of the few people who still keeps an eye on things around here. Hughes nodded, a flicker of recognition lighting his thoughts. Harris had always been reliable, though perhaps a little too nosy for his own good. Still, the man might have noticed something valuable. Where's Veronica? Hughes asked, though he already had a suspicion of where she might be. She's inside. In the room she and George shared, Ramirez replied. She's in shock. Hasn't said much since we got here. Let's go talk to her, Hughes said, and made his way toward the inn. The quiet hum of the place felt out of place with the chaos outside. Inside, the inn was dim, lit by soft lamps that cast long shadows along the walls. The smell of stale coffee and the faint trace of something else, something familiar, lingered in the air. It smelled like a place where long-held secrets and quiet tensions could ferment, unnoticed by outsiders. Hughes climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor and knocked gently on the door of the room where Veronica had been staying. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-30s, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged, as if she hadn't slept in days. She looked like someone who had been waiting for the inevitable. Her gaze was distant, but there was a hollow look in her eyes that suggested a depth of sorrow far beyond what Hughes had expected. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Hughes said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm Detective Hughes. I'm terribly sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you a few questions." Veronica didn't respond right away. She seemed lost in thought, staring at the floor. After a long pause, she finally lifted her gaze to meet Hughes's eyes. Her voice was shaky, like a person who had already cried out all their emotions. I don't know what happened," she whispered. "I was in my room. I didn't hear anything, not until the police came." Hughes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Can you tell me about the night before this happened? Were you with George? Did anything unusual happen?" Her face twisted slightly as she looked away. She hesitated for a long time before speaking, as if the words were weighing her down. "We argued," she said finally, her voice quiet, almost reluctant. "George, he was drinking. Again. He was angry. He always was. It wasn't anything new. But this time, I think he was more upset than usual." "Why?" Hughes asked, pushing gently. "What was it about?" Veronica shook her head, her hand rubbing her temple. "It's hard to explain. He wasn't the same man I married. He'd changed. He was jealous. Of everyone. Of me. Of Frank. He couldn't stand it. He hated that I spent time with Frank." Hughes paused, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. "You and Frank Turner," he said carefully, watching her closely. Veronica looked up at him, a flash of something, fear, perhaps, crossing her face before she quickly masked it with an empty expression. "It wasn't like you think," she replied, her voice low. "Frank and I were friends. But it was more than that. We couldn't stay away from each other." Hughes nodded slowly. The affair was no secret to anyone in town, but now it seemed like it was the centerpiece of the investigation. Veronica's relationship with Frank Turner, her marriage to George, and now George's violent death, everything pointed to a deeper, darker secret. The investigation was just beginning, and Hughes could already feel the weight of the tangled emotions and motivations that had led to George Whitaker's death. But the biggest question of all still loomed: who killed George Whitaker, and why? Detective Stephen Raul Hughes spent the next few hours gathering information from the inn's staff, carefully piecing together the narrative surrounding George Whitaker's life. He began with the employees, those who had spent the most time around George and his wife, Veronica. The inn, though small, had become a second home for several of them, and they were often privy to the subtle undercurrents of tension that ran through the Whitaker household. Hughes had always found it useful to speak to those who had no stake in the drama, the quiet observers who might see things others missed. One of the housekeepers, a woman in her mid-40s named Janice, had been with the inn since it first opened. She seemed to take a measured, almost disinterested approach when Hughes asked about George and Veronica. Her responses were short, but after a few moments of coaxing, she spoke candidly about the problems in the Whitaker marriage. George wasn't a bad man, at least not when he first started, Janice began, her hands twisting the cleaning cloth in her lap. But as the years went on, he started to change. He became possessive. I think Veronica started to feel trapped. She'd talk about it sometimes, not openly, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't happy. Not at all. Hughes nodded, listening intently. What kind of changes? How did he treat her? Janice hesitated, glancing toward the doorway as if expecting someone to overhear. He started drinking more. He'd snap at her, even in front of people. He didn't want her talking to anyone, not even the guests. And when he did talk to her, well, let's just say it wasn't always with kindness. Veronica was always so calm, so collected, but I could tell she was afraid of him. Hughes made a note of this. Veronica's fear seemed to be a common theme among those who worked at the inn. The jealousy, the temper, the possessiveness, it was all adding up. But there was still something Hughes couldn't shake off. Despite all the tension in the marriage, it didn't seem like George was capable of murder. Or at least, not on his own. Hughes had been in enough cases to know that sometimes, a relationship's dynamics could become so toxic that they drove people to commit acts of violence. But this was different. There was something more at play here. He turned to the staff, each of them seemingly uneasy with the task of talking about their employer, but he pressed on. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed, could be crucial. The most insightful testimony came from a young waitress named Claire, who had worked at the inn for almost a year. Claire was soft-spoken and clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Hughes was able to coax her into a conversation. She sat at the corner of the inn's small break room, twisting the end of her apron as she spoke. "I don't know what you want me to say," Claire muttered, avoiding Hughes's gaze. "But I saw Veronica and Frank together. A lot. More than once, for sure." She glanced up at Hughes, her eyes wide with concern. "But they didn't try to hide it. I know what it looked like, and I know it wasn't just some friendly chats. It was something else. And everyone knew it, but no one said anything." Hughes leaned forward, his mind working through the pieces. The relationship between Veronica and Frank Turner, the mechanic, had always been the talk of the town, but to hear Claire admit that they hadn't been careful about hiding it, well, that was something new. "When did you see them together? Did anything stand out that night, before George's death?" Claire's voice dropped lower as she recalled the evening. "It was late. Around 10 or 11 o'clock. Veronica had come in with Frank. She looked upset, pale, almost like she'd been crying. She asked for a room right away, no questions. Frank seemed distant. Like he was trying to stay out of the way. But they didn't stay in the common areas long. I saw them go upstairs." Hughes's mind raced. Veronica had been upset. She'd come in with Frank, and they disappeared upstairs without a second glance. Was it the confrontation that had sparked George's death? Had something happened between Frank and George that led to this brutal hit and run? Or was Veronica involved in a way that she hadn't let on? "Do you know if George and Veronica had argued that night?" Hughes asked, his voice measured but intent. Claire shrugged. It wasn't unusual for them to argue. George had been drinking more lately. But I didn't hear anything specific. They were both so closed off. It's like they didn't want anyone to know how bad it had gotten. But if you're asking if they were fighting, I'd say yes. It was probably inevitable. Hughes took a moment to absorb Claire's words. The tension between George and Veronica seemed like the tip of the iceberg. But there was still no solid proof that either Frank or Veronica were involved in the hit and run. The details were sketchy, but the pieces were beginning to come together. A jealous, volatile husband, a passionate, forbidden affair, and a woman caught in the middle, who may have been pushed to her breaking point. As Hughes made his way back to his car, he thought about the absence of George's vehicle. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious fight. Whoever had killed George had planned it carefully. He thought of the skid marks near the scene, deliberate, calculated, like someone trying to cover their tracks. It was starting to feel more like a trap, like George had been bait, and someone had lured him into it. But who? And why? The investigation was no longer just about a hit and run. It was about understanding the web of deceit and desire that had been carefully woven between George Whitaker, his wife Veronica, and Frank Turner. Hughes could sense that the truth was hidden beneath the layers of lies, and it was only a matter of time before it all unraveled. But before he could dive deeper, he needed more answers, especially from the one person who had the most to gain from George's death, Veronica. Hughes was getting closer, but there was still so much to uncover. The affair, the resentment, and now, the murder, all tangled in a dark web that would take more than simple detective work to unravel. The door to Veronica Whitaker's room creaked open as Hughes stepped inside. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the moment he laid eyes on her, he couldn't help but sense a profound sense of discomfort, even in the midst of her apparent calm. Veronica was seated by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes distant as if contemplating something far removed from the scene that had just unfolded in the small town. She was attractive, there was no denying that, but her beauty seemed to be overshadowed by the layers of complexity she wore like a second skin. Her face, pale and drawn, betrayed no sign of distress. Instead, it was a mask of composure, though her eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. They were cold, calculating, yet there was a flicker of something else, guilt? Regret? Or maybe even fear. Hughes couldn't quite place it, but it was there, lingering just beneath the surface. Veronica looked up as Hughes entered, and her lips parted slightly as if to say something. Then, as if reconsidering, she merely nodded, gesturing toward the chair opposite her. "Please, sit. I'm sure you have questions." Hughes hesitated for a moment before settling into the chair. He studied her, his mind already running through the facts. The affair with Frank Turner was no secret. Everyone in town had been talking about it for months. The whispers were louder now in the wake of George's murder. But it wasn't just the affair that had Hughes questioning her, it was the deeper, darker elements that were still veiled. Something wasn't adding up. After introducing himself and confirming the details of George's death, Hughes wasted little time. "Tell me about that night," he began, his voice firm but measured. "Where were you when your husband was killed?" Veronica's lips quivered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms tightly over her chest. "I was here, in my room," she said softly, her gaze never leaving Hughes. "I was upset. I just had another argument with George. I went to my room to get away from him. That's the truth. I didn't hear anything, and I certainly didn't see anything." Hughes watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted to the side as she spoke, a subtle sign of dishonesty. "You didn't hear anything? Nothing at all?" Veronica's gaze hardened, but she quickly regained her composure. "No," she replied, the word more forceful now. "I was in my room all night. Alone. I didn't hear any sounds, no voices, nothing." Hughes wasn't convinced. Her alibi was thin, practically non-existent. And yet, there was something about her, something that felt rehearsed, like she was trying to control the narrative. He leaned forward, pressing his advantage. "You've admitted to the affair with Frank Turner," he said, his voice steady. "But I need to know more. How did that start?" Veronica flinched slightly, as though the question had caught her off guard. She paused for a long moment, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words. It started a long time ago," she said quietly. "I was lonely. George changed. He wasn't the man I married anymore. I never wanted to hurt him, but Frank made me feel alive. He was different. He saw me for who I really was, not just as some trophy on George's arm. And it's true, George found out about it. He wasn't happy about it, to put it mildly. But that was a while ago. It didn't change anything. Frank and we kept seeing each other." Hughes studied her as she spoke, trying to read between the lines. There was an almost dispassionate quality to her words, as though she were explaining something that didn't matter anymore, something that had faded into the background of her life. It didn't feel like remorse. It didn't even feel like guilt. There was just emptiness. And the night of George's death? Hughes pressed, his voice softer now. "Why were you so upset that night?" Her face tightened at the question. Her composure wavered ever so slightly, but she quickly masked it. It was the same as always. George was angry, drinking more than usual. We argued again, like we always did. She paused, her voice dropping. He wasn't a kind man, Stephen. Not anymore. He wanted to control me. And when he couldn't, he drank. And when he drank, he hurt me. Not physically, but in other ways. The worst part was that he didn't even know how to love me anymore. Hughes felt a twinge of empathy, but he couldn't let it cloud his judgment. He needed to focus on the case, on the cold hard facts. "Did you argue that night? Was it worse than usual?" Veronica bit her lip, her eyes darting briefly toward the window. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling for the first time. "It was worse. He accused me of abandoning him. He didn't understand why I was with Frank. He was violent with his words, Stephen. And I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I was leaving. That I couldn't keep doing this. And then?" Hughes asked, his voice gentle but insistent. He could feel the walls Veronica had built around herself slowly begin to crack. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and heavy with emotion. "Then Frank showed up. He told me to come with him. To get away from all of this. To leave it behind." She paused, swallowing hard. "And I wanted to. I wanted to go with him. But something inside me stopped me. I was scared. Scared of what I might do, scared of what I had become." Hughes leaned forward, his gaze steady. But George was still alive. What happened after Frank left? Veronica's expression shifted, her eyes suddenly clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed in my room." Hughes could feel the tension in the room growing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't yet form a coherent picture. Veronica's story, though consistent, was full of gaps, unanswered questions that raised more doubts than they resolved. Was she guilty of her husband's death, or had she been caught in a web she could no longer escape? "You're not telling me everything," Hughes said softly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "There's more to this, Veronica. And I intend to find out what it is." Her eyes flickered briefly with fear. But it was too late to hide now. Hughes was closing in on her, and she knew it. Veronica remained silent, the mask of composure slipping. Detective Hughes was no stranger to the complexities of human nature, and the web of lies and half-truths he had encountered in this case made him all the more determined to uncover the full truth. The story of George Whitaker's death was starting to piece itself together, though Hughes knew there was still much more lurking beneath the surface. Over the next few days, Hughes focused his attention on Frank Turner, the quiet, brooding mechanic who had become a central figure in the investigation. Turner's past was a far cry from the idyllic life he seemed to crave with Veronica. While there were no records of major crimes, his violent tendencies had made him a frequent presence in the local police reports. His record was a patchwork of minor offenses, bar fights, public disturbances, and a few run-ins with the law for assault, though nothing that would connect him directly to murder. Hughes sat in his car, parked outside Turner's modest workshop. The mechanic's vehicle, an old but well-maintained pickup truck, was parked near the entrance, but there was no sign of Frank himself. Hughes had grown accustomed to the silence that surrounded this case, but today, it felt heavier than usual. His instincts told him there was something more, something Turner was hiding. A few hours later, Hughes caught up with Turner at the local diner. The mechanic's sullen demeanor had always made him hard to read, but today he was especially tight-lipped. Hughes wasted no time, sitting down across from him and studying him intently. "Frank," Hughes began, his voice steady but firm, "I've been looking into your history. You've been in and out of trouble before, but none of that has anything to do with what happened to George Whitaker, right?" Turner met Hughes's gaze with a defensive scowl. "I didn't kill him," he growled. "I don't know what happened to him, all right? I was there that night. That's it. You're wasting your time." Hughes was careful not to show any reaction. The man's defensiveness was telling, but Hughes had seen this kind of reaction before. People who were involved in something but didn't want to face it head-on. "I'm not wasting my time, Frank," Hughes replied. "I'm just trying to understand what happened. You were the last person to see George alive, weren't you?" Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window. He seemed to be searching for something outside the diner, anything to avoid the conversation. But after a few long moments, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was. I went to the inn that night. I saw him, we talked. But I didn't kill him. I don't know who did." Hughes narrowed his eyes. "You don't know? Funny, because when I looked at the evidence, I found something that doesn't add up. Those tire marks at the scene of George's death didn't match his car, they matched a vehicle you're known to drive." Turner's face drained of color, and he clenched his fists beneath the table. His eyes flashed with panic, but he quickly masked it. "I don't know what you're talking about. My truck's just like any other truck. It's not me." But Hughes wasn't fooled. He had seen enough of Turner's type to know when someone was lying. The match between the tire marks and Turner's truck wasn't a coincidence. Hughes stood up, his voice growing colder. "You were there that night. You struck George with your truck. But this wasn't just an accident. Someone made sure you were there. Someone who wanted this to happen. Someone who's been playing everyone for fools." Turner's face twisted into an expression of frustration. He stood abruptly, leaning over the table toward Hughes. "I didn't want this. I didn't plan it. You think I wanted George dead?" His voice was raw with emotion, and for the first time, Hughes saw the vulnerability in Turner's eyes. Hughes didn't flinch. He had been dealing with murder suspects for long enough to know when the truth was finally being dragged out of someone. "But you didn't stop it either, did you? You let it happen. You let Veronica control this." At the mention of Veronica's name, Turner's expression changed. There was a flicker of guilt, maybe even regret. Hughes saw it, and he knew then, Turner wasn't the mastermind here. He was a pawn in someone else's game. "Veronica," Turner muttered, his voice dropping. "She said George had to go. She said it was the only way. But I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to kill him. She made it sound so easy. She told me it would be over. That we could be together." Hughes pressed on, his voice steady. "Veronica told you to do it? She was behind this?" Turner looked up, his gaze finally locking with Hughes's. There was no more fear in his eyes, just resignation. "I didn't think she meant it. I didn't know she'd go that far. But she knew how to manipulate me. She knew I'd do anything for her." As the truth began to unravel, Hughes felt a cold sense of certainty settling in his chest. Turner had been an unwilling participant, but Veronica had orchestrated the entire thing. She had manipulated Frank into committing the crime and had been planning George's death for weeks, if not longer. With Turner's confession, Hughes had enough to confront Veronica. The walls of the small, dimly lit room seemed to close in around Veronica as she sat across from Detective Stephen Raul Hughes. He had already shown her the evidence, Frank Turner's confession, the tire tracks that matched his truck, the sequence of events leading up to George Whitaker's death. But Veronica still couldn't bring herself to admit the full truth. She had tried to maintain her composure, to deny any involvement, but now, facing the detective's unrelenting gaze, the facade was beginning to crack. "You don't understand," Veronica snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and rising anger. "George was a monster. He was controlling, violent. I couldn't take it anymore. He was suffocating me, and Frank was my way out, my chance to start over." Hughes leaned forward, his expression cold but resolute. "Start over? By murdering your husband?" Veronica's eyes flashed with something darker. It wasn't just guilt, it was something closer to desperation. "Yes, that's what I had to do. Don't you see? George was unbearable. He would have never let me go. He always had his grip on me. But Frank was different. He understood me. He offered me the freedom I thought I could never have." Her voice quivered as she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if the weight of her secret had been eating at her from the inside. "It was supposed to be simple. Frank didn't want to do it, but I pushed him. I told him George had to go. I made sure everything was set up. I lured Frank to the inn that night, pretending I needed comfort after a fight with George. I knew George would be vulnerable then. It was the perfect opportunity. Hughes felt a chill run down his spine as he processed her words. The cold, calculated nature of her plan was chilling. Veronica had meticulously orchestrated George's death, using Frank as both a pawn and an accomplice. She had taken full advantage of her affair to manipulate Frank into doing the unthinkable. And once George was dead, she had imagined herself free to run away with Frank, to escape the life she had so thoroughly despised. You used Frank, Hughes said softly, his voice laced with disgust. You convinced him to kill your husband, and you were going to leave everything behind. And when it was over, when you thought you'd be free, you would disappear with him. Veronica's face twisted in a mixture of shame and defiance. I didn't think it would end like this. I thought I could escape. I thought Frank and I could have a life together. But everything's falling apart now. It's all ruined. Hughes took a step back, his eyes cold. You killed George Whitaker, and you thought you could run away with a new life. But in the end, it was your own actions that sealed your fate. You made a deal with the devil, and now you're both going to pay for it. The room was thick with the tension of the moment as Hughes stared at Veronica. He had seen countless cases of betrayal and murder, but something about this one felt particularly hollow. Veronica had sought to erase her past, to rid herself of George, to rid herself of her marriage, and to escape the suffocating life she had created. But in doing so, she had sealed her own doom. The escape she had longed for was now impossible. She had played the part of the victim, but in truth, she had been the architect of her own destruction. As Hughes turned to leave, he couldn't help but reflect on the bitter irony of it all. Veronica had sought freedom by killing George, but she had never truly escaped the consequences of her actions. The tragedy was that she had used Frank Turner, a man who was already broken in his own right, to carry out her plan. And now, both of them would face the consequences. Hughes arrested Veronica first, her eyes still wide with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She had fought against the truth for so long, but now it was too late. Her world had crumbled, and all that was left was the bitter reality of her actions. She was led away in handcuffs, her face pale, the facade of control completely shattered. Frank Turner, too, was arrested. Though he had been an unwilling participant in the crime, his involvement in George's death couldn't be denied. The evidence was clear, and Hughes could see the deep regret in Frank's eyes. But it wasn't enough to absolve him. He would have to pay for his part in the murder, just as Veronica would. The inn, once a place of solace and comfort, now felt like a tomb. The memories of George Whitaker lingered in the rooms, his life violently ripped away in the name of a desperate escape. But now, as Hughes left the scene, the truth had been revealed. The tangled web of lies, betrayal, and murder had unraveled, and justice would take its course. For Hughes, the case was closed. But the sense of futility that lingered was hard to shake. Veronica had killed her husband for freedom, but in the end, she had only brought herself deeper into the darkness. There was no escaping the consequences of such a crime. No matter how hard she tried. As Hughes walked away from the inn, he couldn't help but reflect on the nature of desperation. How far would a person go to escape their past? How many lives would be destroyed in the process? In the case of Veronica Whitaker, the answer was clear. Desperation had led her to murder, and in the end, it had consumed her completely. The darkness was deep, and no one, not even Veronica, could escape it. Case 19, The Silent Star. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood in the center of an abandoned lot, the cold grip of morning fog lingering in the air. The streets were still sleepy, wrapped in the kind of silence that only early mornings could muster. His breath condensed in short bursts, a stark contrast to the dark, grim scene before him. Eleanor Drew's body had been discovered hours earlier, cold, unceremonious, and cruelly mutilated, and Hughes knew that this wasn't just another routine case. The woman, barely in her 20s, had been left in the most public of places, a vacant lot on the edge of the downtown district, a place where the city's back alleys intersected with dreams of glamour. The irony wasn't lost on Hughes. This was the same city that promised stars and stardom, where so many young hopefuls came to seek fame and success, only to find the harshest of realities instead. Drew's body, once a symbol of that hopeful future, had now been reduced to a gruesome spectacle. Her pale skin was streaked with the remnants of the crime, her dark, shoulder-length hair clinging to her face. She had an air of forgotten glamour about her, her features delicate but bruised, with an aura of vulnerability that only emphasized the tragedy of a life cut short. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide in that final expression of shock and fear. The haunting beauty of her face suggested a life that had once held promise, now violently interrupted by a world that had no room for the broken. The manner in which her body had been discarded made Hughes's stomach turn. Her torso had been severed at the waist, and the upper and lower halves were positioned apart as though someone had carefully placed them there for all to see. The crime wasn't just a murder, it was a deliberate, calculated statement. Whoever had done this had wanted to make sure that no one could ignore the message, that the act itself would become part of the city's forgotten history. As Hughes took in the scene, his mind raced through the possible motives. The brutal, precise nature of the crime mirrored the world in which Eleanor Drew had lived, a world of broken dreams and merciless ambition. She had come to the city to seek fame, but like so many others, the city had swallowed her whole, only to spit her out once it had no use for her anymore. From the corner of his eye, Hughes noticed his partner, Detective Marcy Eastwood, stepping onto the lot. She had been at the scene long before Hughes arrived, but he had a reputation for showing up when the investigation reached its boiling point. Her eyes met his, and he saw the weariness behind them, the kind of exhaustion that came from dealing with cases like this, cases where the answers didn't come easily. "You're late, Detective," Eastwood said with a dry, almost amused tone, trying to mask the tension in her voice. "Had to take a detour," Hughes muttered, his gaze never leaving the body. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, not when the situation felt as heavy as it did. Eastwood took a deep breath and ran her fingers through her short-cropped hair. "Not much more than what you see, really." She was a struggling actress, no real credits to her name. A few modeling gigs, a couple of failed screen tests. That's it. Her resume, if you can call it that, is practically non-existent. "Anyone miss her yet?" Hughes asked, his voice low but sharp. He knew better than to expect an easy answer, but it was a question worth asking. Eastwood nodded as she pulled out a file from her bag. She was known around town. No family to speak of, but some acquaintances, other hopefuls in the business. Still, no one seems to know much about her. The ones who did seem to know her haven't offered much in the way of details. It's almost like she didn't exist outside of the clubs, the parties, and the late-night auditions. Her past? It's a black hole. Hughes stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings, trying to make sense of it all. Eleanor Drew was just one more person who had come to this city with dreams of something greater, only to be lost to the madness that surrounded her. But something about this case felt different. The brutality of the crime, the calculated nature of it, told Hughes that this was not some random act of violence. This wasn't just a death to be dismissed as the collateral damage of a dream gone wrong. No, this felt deliberate. This killer had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't just to kill, it was to send a message. "There's more," Eastwood said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "We've found a trail of calls and messages from various people in the entertainment industry. Agents, producers, directors, they were all trying to get in touch with her. But no one seems to know much about her, other than that she was a hopeful with stars in her eyes." Hughes's brow furrowed. He hadn't been wrong. This wasn't random. This was personal. The killer was not just sending a message to Drew, they were sending a message to someone, to the world itself, perhaps. The brutality of the crime had too much significance. "I'll take a look at the contacts." "Let's dig deeper," Hughes said, his voice taking on a tone of grim determination. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: whoever had done this wanted more than just a quick end. They wanted the world to know they were capable of this violence, and they wanted their power to be felt. Eastwood glanced at the body one last time before following Hughes as he moved toward the nearest squad car. "You think it's someone close to her?" Hughes's gaze hardened as he climbed into the car, thoughts swirling in his mind. "Could be. Or it could be someone using her as a pawn in a larger game. Whoever did this has a twisted sense of purpose." The two detectives drove in silence, both consumed by their thoughts. Hughes was already piecing together fragments in his mind: her hopes, her despair, the messages that would soon reveal hidden connections. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Hughes knew he had to play it carefully. The crime scene was just the beginning. The story of Eleanor Drew, of the city's promise-turned-nightmare, was far from over. There were many more layers to peel back, more faces to uncover, and more motives to expose. But for now, Hughes was certain of one thing: the answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. And he was going to find them, no matter how deep he had to dig into the city's darkest corners. The sun hung low over Hollywood, casting long shadows on the palm-lined streets. The city of dreams, where stars were made and broken, stood as a quiet testament to ambition and destruction. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes had walked these streets before, though never like this. Now, he was searching for answers in a world that had swallowed up more lives than it had created fame. Eleanor Drew had come to Hollywood with stars in her eyes, just like so many others, hoping to carve her name into the glittering fabric of this sprawling city. She had failed, as so many did, but her death had guaranteed her a place in the annals of its darkest stories. No longer just another forgotten hopeful, Eleanor had become a symbol of Hollywood's brutal reality, the city that chewed up dreams and spit them out, leaving only the bones behind. Hughes's investigation led him deeper into the shadows, speaking to anyone who had known Drew in the last few weeks of her life. The trail was thin. The people she had surrounded herself with little more than echoes of the hollow world she had inhabited. Agents, bar owners, struggling actors, they all had one thing in common: they had little to offer. But then, there was Vincent Hargrave. Hargrave was a name that reverberated in the circles of Hollywood power. A film producer whose rise had been marked by both brilliance and scandal, he had a reputation that clung to him like the smoke of a fire long extinguished. Whispers of sexual misconduct, shady business deals, and ruthless manipulation followed him wherever he went. He was the kind of man who used people and discarded them when they no longer served his purpose, a man who could turn the dream of stardom into a nightmare with the flick of his hand. Hargrave's connection to Drew was both murky and undeniable. Some said he had promised her a role in his next big film, others claimed he had taken advantage of her, used her beauty and innocence, only to toss her aside once he was done with her. He was exactly the kind of person Hughes needed to understand in order to piece together the puzzle that had been Eleanor Drew's final days. When Hughes tracked Hargrave down, he found him in his upscale office, overlooking the neon lights of the city like a king surveying his kingdom. The room was sleek and modern, adorned with expensive art and a view that screamed success. But there was something about the man that didn't fit. Hargrave's polished appearance couldn't mask the restlessness that lingered in his eyes. He greeted Hughes with a tight smile that seemed more like a nervous tic than a genuine expression of welcome. "I'm sorry, Detective," Hargrave said, his voice smooth but strained, like a man accustomed to giving rehearsed answers. "I barely knew her. She came to a few parties, but that's all. I didn't even know she was dead until you showed up at my door." Hughes studied Hargrave closely, noting the way his eyes flickered, betraying an anxiety that his words couldn't quite conceal. The smooth facade of Hollywood's elite crumbled just enough for Hughes to see the cracks beneath. "You were one of the last people she reached out to," Hughes said, his voice low and deliberate. "What about the phone calls? Care to explain?" Hargrave stiffened. For a brief moment, the polished veneer seemed to slip further. His mouth pressed into a tight line, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to being cornered, to being made to answer questions about his actions. But Hughes had seen enough to know when someone was lying, and Hargrave's hesitation spoke volumes. "I didn't kill her," Hargrave said, his voice rising a notch, though it wasn't with the kind of conviction that would sway Hughes. "I never touched her in that way. But she was desperate. She wanted something more, and I couldn't give her that. I told her to move on, to find someone else." The words were too rehearsed, too clean to be the truth. Hughes could tell Hargrave was trying to distance himself from Drew, trying to wash his hands of any connection, but there was something about the way he said desperate that rang false. People in Hollywood didn't speak of desperation in such a dispassionate way unless they were trying to mask their own involvement in it. "And did you?" Hughes pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Did you tell her to move on, or did you make promises that you couldn't, or wouldn't, keep?" Hargrave's lips twitched, but he didn't respond immediately. The silence hung in the air between them, thick and uncomfortable. Hughes waited, allowing the tension to build, to make Hargrave squirm just a little more. Finally, Hargrave let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair with a feigned nonchalance that didn't fool Hughes for a second. "I gave her advice, Detective," Hargrave said, his voice growing defensive, though still controlled. "She was too eager. Too naive. She wanted a quick way in, something that could get her to the top. I told her it didn't work like that. I told her she'd have to be patient, that the right role would come along when the time was right. But she didn't want to hear it. She was needy." Hughes took a slow step forward, eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the film producer's every word. "And that's it? No other involvement? No promises, no expectations, no strings attached?" Hargrave's eyes flickered again, but this time, Hughes caught the briefest glimpse of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Hargrave cleared his throat and quickly stood, adjusting his jacket as though the conversation had become too much for him to bear. He gave Hughes a tight smile, one that was all business, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you're reading too much into this, Detective," Hargraves said, his voice now too smooth, too practiced. "I barely knew the girl. I'm sure there are other people you should be speaking to. I have nothing more to add." Hughes didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at Hargrave, letting the silence stretch out between them. The producer's words didn't add up, and the longer Hughes stood there, the more certain he became that Hargrave was hiding something, a crucial detail, a hidden motive. Maybe it wasn't Hargrave himself who had killed Eleanor Drew, but he knew more than he was letting on. And that knowledge would be Hughes's leverage. Hargrave might not have been the killer, but he was part of a much larger story. Hughes had learned long ago that in Hollywood, things were rarely as they seemed. There were always hidden connections, veiled intentions, and deals made behind closed doors. If Drew had been involved with Hargrave, there was a good chance that he wasn't the only person who had a stake in her fate. Hughes had to find the others, the ones who had used her and discarded her. The ones who had watched her dream die, and the ones who had watched it die too slowly for their liking. As Hughes left Hargrave's office, the weight of the city seemed to press down on him, as though the very ground beneath his feet was tainted by the secrets it hid. This case was far from over. In fact, Hughes was certain that it was only just beginning. The Hollywood facade was one built on illusion, and behind every glitzy exterior, there were shadows waiting to be uncovered. And Hughes was determined to find them all. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes spent the next few days moving through the labyrinth of Hollywood's glittering illusions, carefully pulling at the threads of Eleanor Drew's life. What had first appeared to be a story of an innocent young woman seeking stardom in the shadows of Hollywood's false promises had quickly transformed into something darker, more sinister. Drew had been caught in a web, woven not just from her personal dreams of fame, but from the tangled threads of relationships that blurred the lines between professional ambition and personal obsession. As Hughes spoke to more people connected to her, it became increasingly clear that Eleanor Drew had not just been a starlet trying to make her way up the social ladder, she had been a pawn in a game played by men who saw her as something to be used, tossed aside, and ultimately discarded. The next person Hughes turned his attention to was Aaron Connolly, a former screenwriter who had tried to reinvent himself as a producer. Connolly had been in Drew's orbit for several months, working with her on a few low-budget films that never saw the light of day. At first, their relationship had seemed professional, mutual ambition, mutual exploitation. But the deeper Hughes dug, the more he realized that Connolly had become obsessed with Drew in ways that went far beyond their professional partnership. The first person Hughes spoke to about Connolly was his ex-wife, a woman whose sharp eyes were clouded with years of bitterness and resentment. She had been more than willing to speak about her former husband, and her words left Hughes with a sense of dread, the kind that whispered of desperation and rage lurking beneath the surface of Connolly's calm exterior. He was obsessed with her, Connolly's ex-wife said, her voice clipped and sharp as if the words had been festering for years. He thought she was the one who would save him, make him famous again. She was supposed to be his redemption, his ticket out of this mess. But all she did was leave him behind when she found someone more important. A bigger name. A real producer. That's when he snapped. The woman's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and sadness, as if the scars of her past marriage had never truly healed. But Hughes had seen enough to understand the depth of her words. Connolly had never let go of Drew, had never fully accepted that she had moved on, leaving him behind in the wake of her own climb through Hollywood's cutthroat ranks. To him, Eleanor Drew hadn't just been a lover or a friend, she had been the key to his own redemption, and when she chose to move forward without him, he had felt betrayed. That feeling of abandonment had festered in Connolly's mind, creating a bitterness that now seemed to consume him. The more Hughes learned, the more it became clear that Connolly had never truly seen Drew as an independent person with her own dreams. To him, she was an object, an opportunity, a stepping stone to reclaim the relevance he had lost in his failing career. But Hughes didn't take Connolly's ex-wife's words at face value. He needed more than just resentment to solidify his suspicions. He paid a visit to Connolly's small office, tucked away in a building far from the star-studded boulevards of Hollywood. The air inside was thick with stale cigarette smoke, and old scripts cluttered the desk, a testament to the man's past life as a screenwriter. Connolly himself was slumped behind the desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. His eyes were bleary, and his posture slouched with the kind of defeat that only time and failed ambition could bring. "Detective Hughes," Connolly said as Hughes stepped into the room, his voice rough from years of too many late nights and too many drinks. "I've been expecting you. You've been poking around my past, haven't you?" Hughes studied him closely, noting the weariness in Connolly's face, the way he flinched when he saw Hughes enter. The man had been drinking to dull the pain of failure, but Hughes knew better than to let that mask what lay underneath. "Tell me about Eleanor Drew," Hughes said, cutting straight to the point. "How did you two really get involved?" Connolly's eyes darted to the side, and for a brief moment, Hughes saw a flicker of something like guilt, something that hadn't quite been masked by his drunken facade. "She was just another actress trying to make it," Connolly said, leaning back in his chair with an air of forced indifference. "We worked together, that's all. Nothing more to it than that." But Hughes didn't buy it. The bitterness in Connolly's voice was too evident, and there was a tension in his body, like he was fighting to suppress something deep inside. "You're lying," Hughes pressed, his voice low and insistent. "I've heard the stories. You were obsessed with her, weren't you? She was your last chance to make it big, wasn't she?" Connolly's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass, but he didn't drink. He simply held it, his knuckles white. "I wasn't obsessed," he muttered. "I just thought she had something special. And when she turned away from me, it hurt." The vulnerability in Connolly's voice rang true in a way that sent a chill down Hughes's spine. Here was a man whose failure had driven him to obsession, whose sense of entitlement had clouded his judgment. But that wasn't the only thing that disturbed Hughes. "You were angry when she chose someone else over you, weren't you?" Hughes said, his eyes narrowing. "Someone with more power. Someone with a bigger name. And in your mind, that meant she had betrayed you." Connolly flinched, the tremor in his hand becoming more pronounced. He couldn't meet Hughes's eyes anymore, his guilt growing heavier with every word. She didn't deserve to die," Connolly whispered, his voice breaking. "But I just wanted her to understand. She had a choice, and she made it, and it left me broken." The broken man sitting before Hughes was a far cry from the man he had once been, a writer whose words had once danced across the silver screen, a man with dreams that had come crashing down when reality set in. But Hughes wasn't done yet. The connection between Connolly and Drew was clear, but there was more to the story. More players in this sick game. And Hughes had a feeling that the more he uncovered, the darker it would get. Hughes could sense the web that had been woven around Eleanor Drew. Hollywood had chewed her up and spat her out, just as it had done to so many others. Connolly, Hargrave, and others in the entertainment industry had used her, manipulated her, and ultimately, discarded her. Hughes was closing in on the truth, but he knew that there was more to discover, more shadows lurking beneath the surface of this broken dream. Eleanor Drew's death was just the beginning. And Hughes wouldn't stop until he had exposed the full extent of the Hollywood machine that had crushed her. As Detective Hughes continued to peel back the layers of Aaron Connolly's life, he discovered the shadow of violence that had followed him like a dark cloud, a storm waiting to burst. The facade of the failed screenwriter-turned-producer was crumbling fast. Hughes wasn't just dealing with a broken man consumed by obsession, he was confronting someone who had long harbored the seeds of violence. Connolly's history, at first, had seemed like a string of minor disappointments in a failed career. But the deeper Hughes dug, the more he realized how easily Connolly's fits of rage had escalated from mere frustration to full-blown violence. The old news clippings told the story: multiple bar fights, public outbursts, arguments with colleagues and friends. Those around him described an unpredictable temper, a man who could go from charming to threatening in the blink of an eye. His relationships with women had followed a disturbingly similar pattern: intense infatuation followed by an explosive reaction when they dared to pull away. One particular incident stood out. Hughes discovered that Connolly had been involved in a confrontation with a former girlfriend just a year prior to Drew's death. The woman had left him after he had become too controlling, too possessive. He had threatened her, promising that she'd never find anyone who would love her as much as he did. A police report revealed that Connolly had been arrested for assault, but the charges were quickly dropped after the woman refused to press further. The pattern of violence in Connolly's past seemed almost too perfect, too inevitable. Hughes began to see the pieces falling into place. Connolly's relationship with Drew hadn't been a harmless affair, it had been a dangerous obsession. And when Drew had made the fateful decision to move on, to abandon him for a more powerful man in the industry, Connolly had finally snapped. The breakthrough came when Hughes discovered a series of letters Connolly had sent to Drew in the weeks leading up to her death. These letters, uncovered through a search of Connolly's apartment, were chilling in their contents. Each one was more desperate than the last, a testament to the unraveling psyche of a man who had lost control. In the letters, Connolly alternated between pleading with Drew to come back to him and threatening her with violence if she refused. He spoke of his love, his jealousy, and his growing resentment toward her for abandoning him. One letter stood out in particular, marked by a disturbing threat: "If you don't come back to me, Eleanor, there will be consequences. You'll regret what you've done to me." The sense of entitlement in Connolly's words was staggering. He seemed to believe that Drew owed him something, that her rejection of him was a personal affront. Hughes knew it wasn't just heartbreak that had driven Connolly to this point, it was the unbearable pressure of his own failure, his own delusion that Drew could somehow fix his life. And when she had finally chosen a different path, his mind had cracked. The timeline now seemed clear. Hughes pieced together the events of the day before Drew's death. She had visited Connolly's apartment, ostensibly to talk things through. Hughes could almost see it, the confrontation that had built up over weeks, the raw anger in Connolly's voice as he confronted Drew for rejecting him. In her mind, the conversation had probably been one of closure, a last attempt at peace. But in Connolly's mind, it was a battle he couldn't lose. According to witnesses, Drew had left Connolly's apartment that afternoon, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Hughes could imagine the look on her face as she realized that Connolly was no longer the man she had known, the man she had once shared some fleeting moments with, but something else entirely, something dangerous and beyond redemption. But she hadn't been able to escape in time. Hughes surmised that Connolly had confronted her, perhaps in a fit of rage when she refused to take him back. He had seen her as his last chance at salvation, his last grasp at relevance. And when Drew had rejected him, the weight of his broken dreams had finally shattered the illusion of control he'd so carefully constructed for himself. Connolly's rage had boiled over, but the brutality of the crime went beyond simple murder. The mutilation of Drew's body, severing her at the waist, arranging the pieces in the vacant lot, was a statement. It was his way of punishing her for exposing the dark truths of his own failures. His anger wasn't just about rejection, it was about humiliation, about being shown for what he truly was, a man whose dreams had crumbled, whose future had slipped away, and who had been betrayed by his own delusions. This, Hughes realized, was the key to understanding the gruesome crime. The body had been displayed like a piece of twisted art, the mutilation a grotesque punishment for Drew's perceived betrayal. The killer wasn't just angry, he was vengeful, consumed by a need to control the narrative, to leave a mark that would tell the world how much he had suffered. But that mark, Hughes knew, would also be the key to catching him. It was no longer a question of whether Connolly had killed Drew, he had. The question now was why he had gone to such extreme lengths to make a spectacle of her death. And that, Hughes realized, was where the true horror of this case lay. Connolly's obsession had driven him to the edge of sanity, and in the end, it had led him to murder. The life Drew had once dreamed of, a life of fame, of recognition, of being seen as something more than just another pretty face in Hollywood, had been cut short by a man who could not cope with his own irrelevance. In her death, Drew had become just another tragic story, another casualty of a system that chewed up its stars and spat them out. But Hughes wasn't done yet. There were still questions to answer. The mutilation of Drew's body had been calculated, almost methodical. Connolly had planned it. But what had pushed him to this breaking point? Hughes knew the answer wasn't simple, it never was. But he was getting closer. The case was closing in on its conclusion, and Hughes could feel the walls closing in on Connolly. It was only a matter of time before the shattered illusion of Hollywood's glittering dream came crashing down, and the truth would be revealed for all to see. Hughes stood in the dimly lit apartment, the air thick with tension. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Aaron Connolly sat across from him, his posture stiff, his usually composed face now twisted with a mixture of fear and frustration. He was no longer the charming, disillusioned former screenwriter Hughes had once encountered. The man before him now seemed broken, cornered by his own lies and actions. "You didn't want to be forgotten," Hughes said softly, his voice cool and unwavering. "You didn't want her to forget you. But you never realized how much she wanted to get away from you." Connolly's eyes flickered for a moment, just a fleeting flash of guilt, before hardening into cold defiance. His lips tightened as he leaned back in his chair. "I didn't kill her. She was going to ruin me. She was going to expose me for the fraud I was. I had no choice. She left me." Hughes didn't flinch. He had seen this before, the deflection, the blaming of others, the refusal to accept responsibility for the darkness inside. Connolly's voice quivered, and his hands fidgeted, but the detective could tell that the facade was slipping. "You did this to her," Hughes pressed, stepping closer. "You mutilated her, but in the end, it was your own pathetic need for control that destroyed you. You couldn't bear the idea that she had moved on. And now, you'll pay for it. Connolly's lips trembled, and for a moment, Hughes thought he might break down. But instead, Connolly's expression twisted into something darker, more dangerous. His eyes hardened, and he took a deep breath as if steeling himself against the truth that was closing in around him. She was mine. Connolly spat, his voice rising in anger. She was mine, and you don't understand. I was going to make her a star. I gave her everything. And then she just abandoned me. She left me for some other man, someone more important than me. I was nothing to her. His words became more frantic, each one filled with desperation and denial. Hughes let Connolly talk. The confession was bubbling to the surface, but it had to come on Connolly's terms. It had to be extracted from him slowly, like a venomous truth he could no longer hide. Connolly's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. I tried to fix things. I tried to make her see that I could be someone. That I was worth something. But she laughed at me. She laughed, and then she left. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her destroy me. Hughes's face was expressionless, his mind calculating every word, every hesitation. The confession was coming, but it wasn't the relief he had hoped for. There was no satisfaction in Connolly's words. No sense of justice. Just a broken man, clutching desperately at the remnants of his shattered pride. You couldn't stand that she rejected you, Hughes said, his voice flat. And so, you made sure she could never reject anyone again. You took her life, and in the most brutal way possible. Connolly's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white. He was no longer hiding from the truth, but neither was he accepting it. His confession wasn't the release Hughes had expected. It was a twisted justification, a broken echo of the man he had once been. I didn't want to hurt her. Not at first. But then I saw her with him. With someone else. And that was it. I couldn't let her get away. She had to stay with me. She had to understand what I had done for her. She was going to ruin me. I had to stop her. His voice trailed off, leaving the confession hanging in the air like a foul stench. It was clear now, Connolly's rage had festered into something dark, something poisonous. He hadn't just killed Drew, he had erased her. He had mutilated her body as a final act of control, an attempt to impose his will upon her even after death. Hughes stared at Connolly, his gaze cold. You'll pay for this. For her death. For what you did to her, to the dreams she had, and to the life you stole from her. Connolly didn't respond. His shoulders sagged, the weight of his own words finally starting to settle in. The facade had fallen, but it had done so too late. The truth was no longer negotiable. His crime was clear, and the consequences were inevitable. The investigation was officially closed. The case, which had begun as a mystery filled with unanswered questions, now stood exposed in all its horror. The shattered lives of Eleanor Drew and Aaron Connolly were bound together in a dark, twisted narrative of obsession, desperation, and murder. Drew, a woman who had once dreamed of the stars, had become nothing more than a casualty of Hollywood's ruthless machine. Connolly, a man who had believed in his own importance, had been reduced to a murderer, consumed by his own failings and pride. But Hughes could not shake the haunting image of Drew's final moments. He could picture her, her pale face, her trembling hands, the moment when she had realized the man she had once trusted had become her executioner. The thought lingered in his mind long after the confession, long after the case had closed. As Hughes walked out of Connolly's apartment, the city stretched before him, a sprawling, glittering illusion, a facade hiding the darkness within. The lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Hughes had solved the case, but the city's underbelly had once again proven its ability to devour the innocent, leaving nothing behind but broken dreams. In the end, Hughes couldn't help but wonder how many more would fall victim to the same illusion. How many more lives would be crushed under the weight of Hollywood's promises before the truth finally came to light? The shadows would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to consume those who dared to dream. And in this city, where illusions were more real than truth, Hughes knew that the stories of the lost would never end. The cases would continue, the victims would pile up, and the ghosts of forgotten dreams would haunt the streets forever. With a heavy heart, Hughes walked away from the case that would haunt him for years to come. Case 20, The White Death. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood motionless at the edge of the woods, his breath visible in the cold air as the first snow of the season settled around him like a shroud. The world had gone quiet, wrapped in the eerie stillness that only the first snow could bring. The delicate flakes drifted lazily down, their soft touch against his coat and face almost poetic, but Hughes didn't have the luxury of peace. Not here. Not now. The body of Claire Anderson, a well-respected elementary school teacher, lay crumpled beneath a massive oak tree, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Her once lively face had been drained of color, her vacant eyes staring up at the canopy above as if searching for a way out of the horror that had overtaken her life. The twisted beauty of the scene, the crisp, clean snow surrounding her still form, was marred by the brutality of her death. But it wasn't just her lifeless body that caught Hughes's attention. No, there was something else. Something deeply unsettling about the way her death had been staged. A snowman. A perfectly formed figure stood beside her, seemingly innocent, until you saw the twisted grin carved into its face, a grotesque parody of joy. Its body was an odd contrast, shaped with careful precision, as though it had been crafted by someone with meticulous attention to detail. A red scarf, bright against the white snow, was draped around its neck, giving it an air of mockery, as though the snowman was laughing at Claire's demise. It was a jarring sight, a cruel joke, and Hughes could feel the chill that ran deeper than the cold air surrounding him. The snowman wasn't just a bizarre touch. It was a message. He knew it instinctively, a gut feeling honed from years of experience in the darker corners of the city. This wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever had killed Claire Anderson had made sure to leave something behind, a signature. A mark of ownership over the scene. And Hughes wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. "Detective," a voice broke through the thick silence, sharp but muffled in the heavy snowfall. Hughes didn't need to turn around to know it was his partner, Detective Marcy Eastwood. Her voice, though cold and professional, carried a thread of tension. "It's the first snow, and we've got our first body. Welcome to the season." Hughes didn't respond immediately. He continued to study the scene before him, his mind moving over the details. The body was clearly staged, but the placement of the snowman told him something more. Whoever did this wanted to make a statement. To hide behind the snowman's innocent appearance was to mock the world's perception of good and evil. There was no innocence here. "Tell me about her," Hughes finally asked, his voice steady, betraying none of the disquiet that was starting to gnaw at him. Eastwood stepped closer, her boots crunching in the snow. She was younger, brash yet meticulous, and had proven herself more than capable in their time together. The contrast between the two of them was clear: Hughes, with his seasoned, cynical perspective on the world, and Eastwood, eager and still discovering the ugliness of what lay beneath the surface. She glanced at the body, her face set in a mask of professionalism, but the weariness was there too. The toll this case would take was evident even in the first moments. "Claire Anderson," Eastwood replied, her breath visible in the frosty air. 28 years old. No history of trouble, no enemies that anyone knows of. She was a beloved teacher at the local elementary school. By all accounts, she was, well, normal. Or at least she seemed that way. Hughes didn't move, his gaze fixed on the snowman, trying to glean something from it. "Regular woman, regular life?" he asked, his voice still calm. Eastwood nodded. "Yeah. She had friends, she had a boyfriend, well, ex-boyfriend. The usual stuff. Her social media's all full of photos from her hiking trips, birthday parties, you name it. Nothing out of the ordinary. It's hard to imagine someone would want to hurt her. But here we are." Hughes stepped forward, kneeling beside the body of Claire Anderson. He took a slow, deliberate look at the positioning of her arms and legs, the subtle marks on her skin, the faint outline of bruising. But it was the snowman that kept pulling his attention back. It was too perfect. Too deliberate. Everything about it felt like a message, a call to attention. A cruel, ironic commentary on a life that had once been full of potential, now lost under a blanket of snow. This wasn't just about killing her, Hughes muttered more to himself than to Eastwood, his eyes narrowing. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. Eastwood tilted her head, studying the snowman. What kind of message? Hughes stood up and glanced around the scene, noting the way the snow had collected in perfectly formed patches. It's not just her death. It's the way her body was found. The snowman, it's deliberate. Whoever killed her left it there for a reason. Eastwood's eyes followed his gaze to the snowman. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "You think the snowman's part of it? A joke or something?" "Not a joke," Hughes replied, his voice cutting through the thickening air. "A signature. A mark of ownership. Whoever did this is leaving something behind. It's too staged. Too precise." He stood for a moment in silence, processing the small details that would eventually lead to a breakthrough. "It's not random," he said, more to himself than to Eastwood. "No one just happens upon a scene like this. This killer wants us to see this. To question it. To follow their game." Eastwood stepped closer, her gaze flickering between Hughes and the body. "What are you thinking?" Hughes shook his head slowly. "I'm thinking we need to find out who Claire Anderson was, beyond the social media posts and the smiling photos. There's something more here. Something no one's talking about. Someone wanted to silence her, but they also wanted to make sure we noticed how they did it. The snowman is just the beginning." Eastwood looked at the snowman again, her expression darkening. "So, we're looking for someone with a message to send. Someone who's been planning this for a while." Hughes turned to face her, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Exactly. And until we figure out who that is, we're chasing shadows." For a moment, They both stood in silence, the quiet snowfall around them broken only by the distant hum of the city. Hughes's mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear: the first snow had arrived with a deadly promise. And whoever had orchestrated Claire's death wasn't finished yet. The snowman, frozen in its unnatural grin, stood as a chilling reminder that evil had a way of hiding in plain sight. Hughes wasn't sure yet what the message was, but he was certain of one thing: the killer wanted him to understand it. And he would. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes sat at his desk in the dimly lit precinct, his eyes scanning through the stack of papers on Claire Anderson's life. The initial investigation hadn't revealed much of note. She had been well liked by everyone who knew her, a beloved teacher in the community, with no known enemies. Her social media was filled with photographs of hiking trips, family gatherings, and carefree moments with friends. On the surface, Claire Anderson had appeared to live a quiet, unremarkable life. But something about her death, and the way her body had been positioned with the snowman, told Hughes that there was more to the story than anyone could see. Hughes leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the desk. There had to be something in her past, something that connected Claire to the brutal, calculated murder that had occurred in the woods. A life lived in peace didn't just end like that, not without reason. The carefully placed snowman, the unnatural angle of her neck, the silence in the air, it all pointed to a message, to someone who had planned this. He glanced over at his partner, Detective Marcy Eastwood, who was sitting at the desk across from him, her eyes glued to the phone records they had retrieved from Claire's phone. The hum of the precinct was a constant background, but in this small corner of the room, there was a quiet focus, a sense of urgency hanging between them. "There's nothing to go on," Eastwood said, frustration evident in her voice as she scrolled through Claire's phone records. "These calls are a dead end. No trace, no return number. Whoever did this knew how to cover their tracks." Hughes wasn't ready to give up on the phone calls just yet. Something about the pattern of harassment felt like more than just random noise. It felt personal. But for now, Eastwood was right. They couldn't trace any of the calls, and without more evidence, they were left in the dark. Still, the nagging sense that this wasn't a random killing gnawed at Hughes's mind. "Keep looking," Hughes muttered, not taking his eyes off the records in front of him. He knew they needed something more to move forward. Something that could tie Claire's death to her past. Turning his attention to Claire's history, Hughes focused on the one thing that had stuck with him since they'd first spoken to her friends and colleagues, the name that kept resurfacing in their conversations: Michael Turner. It was a name Claire had long since erased from her life, but it was a name that had found its way back into the investigation. Turner had been Claire's former lover, a man with a violent past. From what Hughes had gathered, their relationship had ended abruptly years ago after an assault in which Turner had been arrested for physically harming Claire. The charges had been dropped under mysterious circumstances, and Turner had disappeared from her life. Now, after a year out of prison, Turner's name was cropping up again, and the timing of it all made Hughes uneasy. "What do we know about Turner?" Hughes asked Eastwood, his voice low but sharp with curiosity. Eastwood paused for a moment, tapping her pen on the desk as she gathered the information. Michael Turner was a high school dropout. He had a pretty extensive criminal record, mostly for assault and battery. Nothing too severe, but enough to make him a problem. He and Claire were involved for a short time, but after the incident, she cut him out of her life completely. We don't have any solid leads on him now, though. He's been out of prison for a year, but he hasn't made any trouble. Or at least, not that anyone can track. Hughes was already on his feet, the wheels turning in his mind. But Claire's dead now, and Turner's name keeps coming up. It's more than a coincidence. Eastwood nodded, but there was a skeptical look in her eyes. You think Turner's involved in this? It's been years. Claire moved on, got a fresh start. You said it yourself, nothing's been pointing to him, but you're wondering if he's the killer? Hughes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gathered his coat, the weight of the case settling heavily on his shoulders. The quiet, steady snowfall outside mirrored his thoughts, a growing storm, a build-up of something inevitable. We'll start with Turner, Hughes said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. We'll track him down, see what he's been up to since his release. If there's any connection between him and Claire's death, we need to know about it now. No more waiting. It didn't take long for Hughes and Eastwood to track down Michael Turner. His last known address was an apartment on the edge of town, a run-down building in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered more often than they stayed lit. Hughes had a bad feeling about the place the moment he laid eyes on it, the kind of place where people went to disappear. They arrived late in the evening, just as the sky was thickening with clouds, and snow began to fall in heavier flurries. Turner's apartment was on the second floor, a cramped unit with a peeling door and a hallway that smelled of stale cigarettes and old carpet. Hughes knocked on the door, his gloved hand creating a sound that echoed in the still air. For a moment, there was silence on the other side, then the faint sound of footsteps, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked older than Hughes had expected, grizzled, with tired eyes and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. Michael Turner. His face was unshaven, and his clothes were worn, hanging off him like he no longer cared about appearances. "What do you want?" Turner asked, his voice rough from years of hard living. "We're here to talk about Claire Anderson," Hughes said, his tone direct, not giving Turner any room for hesitation. "We need to ask you a few questions." The mention of Claire's name seemed to hit Turner like a physical blow. His posture stiffened, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Was it fear? Or guilt? Hughes couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. What mattered was finding the truth. "I don't know anything about her," Turner said quickly, his eyes darting away from Hughes's steady gaze. "I haven't seen Claire in years." "She's dead? Is that what this is about?" Hughes didn't flinch. "We need you to come with us. There's a connection between you and her death, Turner. We're not leaving until we get answers." Turner's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Hughes thought he was going to slam the door in their faces. But instead, Turner stepped aside reluctantly. "Fine. But I've got nothing to say about it. You're wasting your time." Inside, Turner's apartment was as barren as his demeanor. A few mismatched pieces of furniture, empty beer cans scattered on the floor, and the faint smell of stale food in the air. Hughes knew the man wasn't living a life of luxury, but he also knew Turner wasn't the type to be content in such a state. He'd been a man who once had a violent temper, who had used his fists to solve problems. Now, he was a man who seemed to have given up. Or maybe he was just hiding something. Hughes and Eastwood sat across from him at the small kitchen table, Turner's unkempt hair falling in his eyes as he stared down at the tabletop, his fingers tapping nervously. Hughes leaned forward, his eyes locked on Turner's. "We know you had a relationship with Claire," Hughes said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of accusation. "We also know that you were arrested for assaulting her, but the charges were dropped." And now she's dead. Turner shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing with anger. I didn't hurt her. I never did. Yeah, we had our problems. But I loved her. I would never have. He stopped, his voice faltering as his gaze shifted to the floor. Hughes studied him closely. There was something Turner wasn't saying, and Hughes could feel it. Then why was she so afraid of you? Hughes asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Turner's eyes snapped up, his face going pale. I wasn't the one who hurt her, he snapped, but Hughes could see the tremor in his hands. For a moment, Hughes sat back, letting the silence hang in the air. He wasn't ready to believe Turner was innocent. There was too much at stake. Too many questions left unanswered. Hughes stood up slowly, his mind already turning over the next steps. We'll be in touch, Turner. Don't go anywhere. As they left the apartment, Hughes felt no closer to the truth. But one thing was clear, Michael Turner's story didn't add up. And Hughes wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. The snowflakes were falling heavier now, as if the world was being slowly swallowed by the winter storm. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes stood at the edge of the forest, staring down at the body of Rachel Whitmore, a local barmaid with a reputation for her charm and easy smile. Her body was placed in much the same way as Claire Anderson's, positioned beneath a tree with unnerving precision. The snowman, crafted with the same meticulous care, stood beside her, dressed with the same red scarf, the same mocking grin carved into its face. Hughes felt the familiar chill of dread creep over him, this time more intense than before. This was no longer a random act of violence, it was personal. The snowman had become a twisted signature, a taunting mark left by a killer who wanted to send a message, not just kill. Rachel's death mirrored Claire's, and that could not be ignored. Two bodies, same M.O., Eastwood murmured, her voice low and filled with grim realization. She knelt next to the body, careful not to disturb the crime scene as she examined Rachel's lifeless form. We're looking for someone who thinks this is a game. Hughes didn't respond immediately. He stood still, his gaze flicking from the snowman to Rachel's body, then back to the snow-covered ground. This was no coincidence. The similarities between the two murders were too precise, too deliberate. The snowman wasn't just a symbol of the killer's twisted sense of humor, it was a message, and Hughes was determined to decode it. Rachel Whitmore wasn't a stranger to Claire Anderson. In fact, they'd crossed paths often. Claire had been a frequent customer at the bar where Rachel worked, mostly stopping by for a drink after attending school events, a quiet night away from the demands of teaching. Hughes was familiar with the bar. It was a local hangout for the townspeople, but also a place where secrets were buried beneath the surface. There had to be a connection between Rachel and Claire's deaths. As Hughes and Eastwood continued to process the scene, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift in his mind. Was the killer targeting women who had known Claire? Or was this something deeper, perhaps a personal vendetta against Claire herself that was being projected onto those around her? The deeper Hughes thought about it, the more troubling the connections became. The snowman, was it a reference to something from Claire's life? Had she been unknowingly linked to someone who had built this twisted pattern of violence? Or was it the killer's way of mocking her, of creating some bizarre link between her and these other women? Why Rachel? Hughes muttered, more to himself than to Eastwood. What's the connection? Eastwood stood up, brushing the snow from her gloves. Rachel worked at the bar where Claire sometimes went. They were friendly. Nothing major, but enough for them to be connected. Hughes's eyes narrowed. That was the missing piece. The killer wasn't targeting just anyone. Rachel's death wasn't just about killing another woman, it was about making a connection between the victims. The killer wasn't finished yet. Claire was just the beginning. Back at the precinct, Hughes reviewed the details of Rachel Whitmore's life. The connection to Claire was clear, but the more Hughes delved into Rachel's history, the more troubling details emerged. Rachel had kept to herself after Claire's murder, avoiding public attention and steering clear of police involvement. Was she running from something? Had she known she was next? Hughes couldn't be sure, but the odd, unsettling feeling in his gut told him there was something Rachel had known, something important. Eastwood, Hughes called, his voice sharp with determination. Get me a list of everyone who worked at that bar around the time Claire used to come in. We're going to need to look at all of them. Someone might have seen something, and maybe Rachel knew more than she let on. Eastwood nodded, her fingers already typing on her phone as she pulled up the bar's employee records. It was a small lead, but Hughes knew they had to follow it. Everything was connected now, and the pattern was forming, a killer who was carefully selecting his victims, one by one, each with ties to Claire Anderson. As they sifted through Rachel's past, Hughes felt a growing sense of urgency. Every new piece of information seemed to lead them down a darker path. The killer wasn't just a random person, he was someone with a history, someone who knew exactly how to hide in plain sight. But it was Michael Turner's name that lingered in Hughes's mind. Hughes had already questioned him, but something about Turner's reaction had seemed off. Could Turner be lying? Or was he just another victim in the killer's twisted game? Turner had denied any involvement in Claire or Rachel's deaths. But Hughes couldn't help but wonder, was he being set up, or was he part of a much darker conspiracy? Hughes wasn't satisfied with Turner's previous answers, and he wasn't going to let the man slip through his fingers again. Turner had been in the picture when Claire's life had unraveled, and now, his name kept surfacing as a point of interest. Could he really be innocent in all of this? Hughes wasn't convinced. The next morning, Hughes and Eastwood paid Turner another visit. This time, they weren't asking politely, they were demanding answers. Turner, Hughes said, his voice cold and direct. You're not off the hook. You know more about these deaths than you're letting on. Claire's dead, Rachel's dead, and your name keeps coming up. So, tell me, how are you involved in this? Turner's face went pale, and he hesitated for a moment, looking as though he might crumble under the pressure. But then, his anger flared. I didn't do it. I swear to you. I haven't done anything. Hughes wasn't moved by the protestations. He leaned in closer, his eyes fixed on Turner. You were involved with Claire. You assaulted her in the past. But now, 2 women connected to her are dead. What's your connection to this? Did you kill them, or is someone else using you to cover their tracks? Turner's breathing was shallow, his face turning red with frustration. He clenched his fists and shook his head vehemently. You're not listening to me. I didn't do this. I wasn't even around those women. I'm being framed, don't you see that? Eastwood, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. You keep saying you didn't do it, but you're not giving us any real answers, Turner. We need the truth. Turner's eyes darted around the room, and for a moment, Hughes thought he might break. But instead, Turner remained defiant, his voice cracking under the pressure. I didn't do it, he repeated, his hands trembling. You have to believe me. The investigation into Turner was only one part of the equation. The real puzzle, Hughes believed, was the snowman itself. It was more than just a signature, it was a symbol. But a symbol of what? Hughes returned to the scene of Rachel's murder, walking alone through the snow, the flakes falling gently around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the snowman was trying to tell him something more than just a taunt from a killer. He crouched down beside the snowman, studying it carefully. The expression carved into its face, a grin that seemed almost too perfect, wasn't just a random detail. It was deliberate. The scarf, the pose, everything about the snowman screamed that the killer was trying to communicate something deeper. The killer was playing a game, sure, but the rules of that game were unknown. Why the snowman? Hughes whispered to himself, lost in thought. The answer wasn't coming easily, but Hughes was starting to realize that this wasn't just about murder. It was about a personal vendetta, about using the past to create something sick and twisted. And as the snow continued to fall, Hughes knew one thing for certain: the killer wasn't finished. The game was still unfolding, and Hughes had to stay ahead of it before another innocent woman became the next victim in this dark game. Detective Stephen Raul Hughes sat at his desk, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the case files scattered in front of him. The investigation had taken a deeper turn, but every answer seemed to lead to more questions. The snowman, an eerie signature left by a killer whose motivations were still unclear. Claire Anderson and Rachel Whitmore, two women whose lives had intersected with Michael Turner's in different, yet hauntingly similar, ways. But it was the latest revelation that set Hughes on edge. He had paid another visit to Turner, but the man was as uncooperative as ever, denying any involvement in the deaths of Claire and Rachel. Turner's insistence on innocence didn't make Hughes trust him anymore, but he was beginning to doubt whether Turner was the true killer. There was something deeper at play here, a twisted web of connections, and Hughes could feel himself getting caught in it. The breakthrough came when Hughes decided to speak with Turner's ex-wife. She was a woman who had been burned by Turner's past actions, a woman who had suffered through the volatile relationships and violent outbursts that had defined his life. Now, bitter and resentful, she was reluctant to speak at first. But Hughes had a way of cutting through the walls people built up. His calm demeanor and sharp questions eventually broke her resolve. Turner's ex-wife sat across from Hughes, her eyes tired, as though she had long given up on any hope of closure. "He's a mess," she said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and anger. "I'm telling you, Hughes, someone is playing him like a puppet. He's scared, and for once, it's not because of something he did. It's because of what someone else is doing to him. He's obsessed with Claire, always has been, even after everything. But I don't think he's capable of killing anyone." Hughes leaned forward, listening intently. "What kind of threat are we talking about?" "Threatening phone calls. The same kind that Claire was getting." She hesitated, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of the table. "And they were coming in at all hours of the night, calls that talked about his past. About Claire. The things that had happened between them. It was like someone knew everything about him, but he couldn't figure out who it was. He thought it was just some sick joke, at first." The mention of the calls made something click in Hughes's mind. He had known about the calls Claire had received before her death, the silence on the other end, the cryptic warnings. But Turner? That added a new layer to the mystery. The killer wasn't just playing a twisted game with his victims, he was playing with their pasts. And Turner had been haunted by Claire's memory, his obsession with her pushing him to the brink of madness. The connection between them was undeniable now. "Did Turner ever mention the calls to you?" Hughes pressed. The ex-wife shook her head. "Not directly. But he'd always mention that someone knew too much. He was convinced someone was out to get him. I thought he was paranoid, but now, I'm not so sure." Hughes sat back, piecing the new information together. Turner had been scared, but not of the police. He had been afraid of something, or someone, who was pulling his strings. This was more than just a random act of violence. Someone was orchestrating these killings, using Turner as part of their sick game. Hughes's mind kept returning to the letters Turner had written to Claire. He had uncovered them during his initial investigation into Turner's past, and at the time, he hadn't thought much of them. The letters had seemed like the ramblings of a desperate man. Turner had pleaded with Claire to forgive him for his past violence, begging her to take him back, to start fresh. The language in the letters was filled with desperation, but there was one line that had always stood out to Hughes: "If you don't come back to me, there will be consequences." The words echoed in his mind. Turner had been so certain that Claire would come back to him, so certain that she would forgive him. But when she didn't, when she walked away, his anger had consumed him. Was this a man on the edge? Or had the consequences Turner had promised in the letter been carried out by someone else? Hughes pulled the letters from the file and studied them again, searching for any clue he had missed before. There was a pattern here, a pattern of obsession, anger, and a chilling sense of entitlement. Turner had believed that Claire belonged to him, and that her rejection had justified his rage. But this wasn't just about Turner. Someone had used his obsession, manipulated it, and turned it into something far darker. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but Hughes wasn't sure if he was seeing the whole picture yet. Rachel Whitmore's murder had been the key to unlocking a new layer of the investigation. Hughes had known Rachel casually, but as he dug into her life, he discovered more connections between her and Claire than he'd initially realized. Rachel had worked at the same bar where Claire sometimes went after school events, and the two women had become friends of sorts. That wasn't all, though. Rachel, like Claire, had received threatening calls from a voice that seemed to know too much about her past and her connection to Claire. Hughes's mind raced as he pieced together the information. The killer wasn't just targeting women at random. He was targeting women who had been part of Claire's life, people who had either been involved with her, worked with her, or crossed paths with her in some way. Rachel had worked at that bar, and now she was dead. The same person who had killed Claire had murdered Rachel as well. The snowman had been left by both victims, a mocking gesture of the killer's dominance, a twisted signature. But why? The killer wasn't just trying to kill Claire's friends. He was trying to erase her life, to destroy everything she had touched, and to rewrite the narrative in a way that suited his sick desires. Rachel was connected to Claire. Turner had been obsessed with Claire. And now, both of them were victims in a game that Hughes was just starting to understand. The most disturbing discovery came when Hughes uncovered yet another link between Rachel and Turner. Rachel had, in fact, been in contact with the same mysterious voice that had tormented Claire. A phone call had been made to her the night before her death. The message was chilling, a warning that had eerily mirrored the calls Claire had received. Stay away from Claire's life. If you don't, you'll pay the price. Hughes stood still for a moment, the realization hitting him like a wave. The killer had been targeting people who had been close to Claire, and now he was using the same tactics, phone calls, threats, and violence, to destroy anyone who had ties to her. But why? What was the killer's ultimate goal? The pattern was clear now. Claire had been the catalyst, the central figure. And now, the killer was trying to erase everyone who had been part of her life, one by one. But Hughes still didn't know why. What had Claire done to deserve this kind of fate? And who was the mastermind behind it all? As Hughes walked through the icy streets of the city, the weight of the case bore down on him. He knew one thing for certain: the killer wasn't finished yet. The web was tightening, and Hughes needed to find the next thread before another life was claimed by the shadows of the past. As Hughes sat in his office late into the night, a dark realization settled in his gut. He had spent weeks chasing shadows, trying to understand the mind of a killer who left behind a signature, a snowman, a twisted reflection of his fractured psyche. But the more Hughes delved into the case, the more he realized something crucial: Michael Turner wasn't the killer. And neither were the women connected to Claire's life. There was another player in this macabre game, someone who had been lurking in the background, quietly watching, unnoticed by everyone else. It was during his final review of Claire's old school records that Hughes's instincts finally snapped into place. There was a name he had overlooked: Jared Hanks. He was a former classmate of Claire's, someone who had been in the periphery of her life but had never been noticed. Claire had moved on, building a career, finding love, and eventually marrying. But Hanks had never moved on. His obsession with her had festered quietly, a sickness growing in the background, unnoticed by everyone. As Hughes dug deeper into Hanks's past, he found a trail of unsettling behavior, small, seemingly insignificant incidents that had been brushed aside. Hanks had been a quiet, shy man in school, someone who faded into the background, never daring to make himself known. Claire, like everyone else, had forgotten him the moment she graduated. But Hanks hadn't forgotten her. He had never stopped thinking about her, even as her life moved on without him. And when she married, when she became happy, something in Hanks snapped. The pieces began to fall into place. The snowman was his signature, his twisted way of holding onto her memory, to his obsessive fixation. Claire had moved on from him, but Hanks's obsession with her turned violent when he couldn't stand the thought of being ignored any longer. He killed Claire, then Rachel, all the while leaving the snowman as a mocking tribute to his inability to claim her attention. It didn't take long for Hughes to track Hanks down. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, blending into the fabric of the city's forgotten spaces. Hughes found him in a remote cabin outside the city, a dilapidated place that seemed to mirror the brokenness of Hanks's mind. The snow had stopped falling by the time Hughes arrived, but the silence of the world around him felt suffocating. Hughes approached the cabin cautiously, his breath coming in short bursts as he stepped over the snow-covered ground. There was no sound coming from inside, no sign of movement. He had prepared for this moment, but even as he reached for the door, his heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The killer was here, and Hughes would finally bring an end to the nightmare. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the center of the cabin, was Jared Hanks. He didn't move as Hughes entered. His posture was rigid, his eyes empty, vacant. "You're the one," Hughes said, his voice low, steady. "You're the one who killed them." Hanks didn't respond at first. He just stared at Hughes with a blank expression, as though he hadn't heard the words. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I just wanted her to remember me," Hanks whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. I wanted her to see me. To know who I was. The words were chilling, more so because of the eerie calm with which he spoke them. Hughes could see it now, the brokenness in Hanks's eyes, the fragile thread of sanity that had snapped long ago. He wasn't a man driven by malice in the traditional sense, but by a sickening need to be seen, to be noticed. His violence wasn't an eruption of rage, it was the culmination of years of quiet, unresolved obsession. Hughes watched him for a moment, the air thick with tension. He could see how far gone Hanks was. This wasn't just a man who had killed in the heat of the moment, this was someone whose twisted mind had been fractured for years, whose obsession had become a dangerous force that had consumed everything in its path. As Hughes stood there, watching the broken man in front of him, something shifted. The calm demeanor Hanks had maintained started to crack. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes flickered with something resembling fear. It was a sign of his impending collapse, a final surrender to the reality of his actions. I never meant for any of it to go this far, Hanks continued, his voice trembling now. I just wanted her to look at me. To see me for who I was. His words faded as he sank to his knees, the weight of his own actions finally crashing down on him. He had been consumed by his need to be noticed, to be seen, to be remembered by someone who had long forgotten him. In the end, the only thing he had succeeded in was destroying everything he had once hoped for. Hughes stood still, watching as Hanks wept in the middle of the cabin. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. The case was solved, yes. The killer had been found. But Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost along the way. The snowman, so innocent in appearance, had been the symbol of a mind shattered by obsession. A symbol of a man who had been invisible for so long that he had resorted to murder to make his presence known. As Hughes left the cabin, he looked out at the quiet world around him. The snow had stopped falling, and the city was wrapped in a blanket of stillness. But beneath that surface, Hughes knew the truth, the shadows were never far behind. The darkness that had been exposed in this case wasn't confined to a single killer. It was something that lingered in every corner, in every mind, waiting to consume. The snowman, the twisted signature left behind by a man who had been invisible to the world, would haunt Hughes for a long time to come. The case was closed, but the lessons learned would linger, reminding him that the most dangerous obsessions often start with something as simple as wanting to be seen. As he walked away from the cabin, the city lights shimmered in the distance, and Hughes couldn't help but wonder how many others, just like Hanks, were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be noticed.
The trail doesn't end, it only twists, and some truths, once uncovered, demand blood in return. You just heard Episode 4 of the Case Files of Detective S.R.H, cases 16 to 20, written by me, Raul, for Audible Archives. If these shadows held your breath, like, comment, and subscribe. The deeper we go, the harder it is to come back. And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.